Part 1, the setup. There must be some mistake. First class is for premium passengers. Not, well, people like you. Those words hung in the pressurized cabin air of Flight 385, spoken just loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, but not quite loud enough to demand immediate intervention. The woman who uttered them, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer suit, diamond earrings that caught the light with every condescending head tilt, clearly expected compliance. Perhaps an apology, maybe even a shameful retreat to economy class. What she didn't expect was what happened next. You see, Victoria Preston had no idea she was addressing Olivia Morgan, the CEO of a $12 billion tech empire. She had no clue that the mistake she was referring to would cost her family everything they'd worked for. And she certainly never imagined that her casual cruelty toward a 12-year-old girl would trigger the most expensive lesson in respect ever delivered at 35,000 feet. In the next few minutes, you'll witness how a glass of wine became a weapon, how arrogance met its match, and how sometimes the universe delivers justice when you least expect it. This is the story of what happens when people mistake having money for having class, and when quiet dignity proves more powerful than loud privilege. But most importantly, this is about a mother who taught her daughter that their worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, and a family who learned that some bridges burn themselves when you pour gasoline on them. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power, because what you're about to hear proves that the most devastating victories are won not with raised voices, but with quiet grace. Welcome back to Black and Bruised Stories. If you're new here, you've just joined a community dedicated to truth, justice, and survival. Show some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere, put "I belong" in the comments. Let's build this community together. Character introduction. The Morgans. The pristine first-class cabin of Flight 385 represented everything that money could buy. Leather seats wider than most economy-class passengers could imagine. Crystal glasses that had never known the touch of anything less than premium champagne. An atmosphere so refined that even whispers seemed too loud. The air itself smelled different up here, a blend of expensive perfumes, leather conditioner, and that indefinable scent of privilege that seems to follow wealth wherever it goes. But what money couldn't buy, as we're about to discover, was the one thing that mattered most: the ability to recognize true worth when it sat right in front of you. Dr. Olivia Morgan moved through this rarefied space with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she chose to be. At 42, she carried herself with that rare combination of quiet authority and understated elegance that made people take notice without understanding why. Her dark skin glowed with health and purpose. Her natural hair was styled in a sleek, professional cut that framed a face more accustomed to solving problems than seeking approval. She wore a simple navy pantsuit, designer but not ostentatious, with a single statement necklace of Ethiopian silver, a gift from her late grandmother who had always told her, "Walk like you own the ground beneath your feet, because your ancestors paid for it in blood and tears." Her 12-year-old daughter, Zoe, followed close behind, clutching a worn copy of Hidden Figures, a book that had become her Bible since learning about the brilliant Black women who helped put America in space. Zoe had her mother's analytical mind and inquisitive spirit, with wide brown eyes that seemed to absorb information from everything around her. Her natural hair was styled in neat box braids with purple accents, her favorite color, and a small expression of her blossoming individuality. She wore a crisp white button-down shirt and a pleated skirt, her airplane outfit that made her feel grown up on these business trips with her mother. But here's what makes this story so incredible. Olivia wasn't just any passenger settling into seat 2A. She was living proof that the American dream could still come true for those willing to work for it. 12 years earlier, she'd been writing code in her garage while her baby daughter napped in a car seat beside her desk. With a PhD in artificial intelligence from Stanford and a vision for technology that could revolutionize healthcare diagnostics, she'd maxed out 3 credit cards and lived on ramen noodles to bootstrap her startup. Investors had dismissed her ideas, some because they didn't understand the technology, others because they couldn't see past her gender and race to recognize her brilliance. Today, That garage startup had become Phoenix Innovations, a $12 billion empire that employed over 8,000 people across 5 continents. Phoenix's diagnostic AI systems were now used in 73% of major hospitals nationwide, reducing misdiagnosis rates by 42% and saving countless lives. The company's machine learning algorithms had expanded into finance, education, and environmental sectors, creating an ecosystem of technologies that made the world smarter, safer, and more efficient. Yet, despite commanding boardrooms filled with world leaders and tech giants, despite having more wealth than most small countries, Olivia's greatest pride wasn't her company's stock price. It was the brilliant young woman sitting beside her, reading about mathematical pioneers and dreaming of her own future among the stars. Zoe Morgan was everything you'd want in a daughter and everything you'd hope for in the next generation. She devoured books like other kids consumed video games, asked questions that made adults think twice, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that comes from watching her mother conquer the world without losing her soul. At 12, she'd already won regional math competitions, developed a simple app that helped her classmates organize their homework, and started a science club for girls at her middle school. Her bedroom walls featured posters of Katherine Johnson alongside those of modern scientists like Dr. Mae Jemison and Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett. To Zoe, her mother wasn't just a CEO. She was proof that grace and power weren't opposites. They were partners. She'd watched her mother navigate boardrooms where she was often the only woman of color, witnessed her handle hostile takeover attempts with strategic brilliance rather than emotional reactions, and observed how she mentored other women rather than seeing them as competition. Olivia had raised her daughter with a careful balance of privilege and perspective. Yes, Zoe attended a prestigious private school and had opportunities many children could only dream of. But she also volunteered twice monthly at a community center in the same neighborhood where Olivia had grown up. She knew her mother's story, not the glossy magazine version, but the real one, with all its struggles and sacrifices. Never forget where you come from, Olivia often told her, and never look down on anyone unless you're reaching out a hand to help them up. As they settled into their first-class seats, Olivia briefly squeezed Zoe's hand, a silent reminder that they were in this together, as they always had been. Character introduction. The Prestons. But fate, as it often does, had seated them directly in the path of everything they'd spent their lives rising above. 3 rows behind them, the Preston family represented a different kind of American story. One where wealth was inherited rather than earned, where privilege was assumed rather than appreciated, and where looking down on others had become so natural it felt like breathing. Victoria Preston entered the first-class cabin like she owned it, because in her mind, she owned everything that mattered. 45 years of inherited wealth and social privilege had taught her that the world bent to accommodate people like her. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in an expensive cut that required maintenance 3 times weekly. Her face showed the subtle signs of high-end cosmetic procedures, not enough to look artificial, just enough to erase the consequences of time and stress. Her Chanel suit probably cost more than most passengers earned in a month, and her diamond earrings represented a down payment on a modest home. She'd never worked a day in her life but considered herself an expert on who deserved what. Born into old money from her mother's side, married into older money from her husband's family, she'd spent decades perfecting the art of looking down on people from heights she'd never climbed herself. The country club was her natural habitat, charity galas her hunting ground for social advancement, and maintaining appearances her full-time occupation. What Victoria never shared at those charity galas or country club luncheons was how desperately she clung to status markers because they were all she had. Her own mother had trained her mercilessly, correcting her posture with painful jabs between the shoulder blades, withholding meals when she used the wrong fork, and constantly reminding her that their position in society required vigilant protection. "There are always people trying to take what's ours," her mother had whispered when Victoria was barely 7, pointing discreetly to a family with darker skin who'd moved into their neighborhood. The lesson had calcified in Victoria's heart. Belonging required excluding others. As a teenager, Victoria had briefly questioned these values. When her high school's only black student, a brilliant girl named Janice who'd won a prestigious scholarship, had invited Victoria to her birthday party, Victoria had almost accepted. For a fleeting moment, she'd glimpsed another way of seeing the world. But her mother's reaction, "We don't socialize with those people. Victoria, what would everyone think?" had quickly extinguished that flicker of independence. By college, Victoria had fully embraced her role as arbiter of who belonged and who didn't. The pattern was set. Her husband Richard followed, already buried in financial reports that told a story his pride wouldn't let him acknowledge. At 50, he was the kind of businessman who confused market position with moral superiority. His silver-gray hair was cut in the same style he'd worn for 20 years. Conservative, predictable, establishing him as part of an old guard increasingly irrelevant in a changing world. His custom-tailored suit couldn't quite hide his slightly stooped shoulders, the physical manifestation of the burden he carried as the third-generation CEO of a company losing ground every quarter. He'd inherited Preston Holdings from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, creating a dynasty built more on momentum than merit. Founded in the manufacturing boom of the post-war era, Preston Holdings had once been a powerhouse in industrial equipment, but while the world had moved forward into the digital age, Preston Holdings had remained stubbornly analog. Richard believed that success was about connections, not competence, and that the right last name opened more doors than the right qualifications. But the cruel irony that would soon unfold was this: Preston Holdings was dying. In a tech-driven world, they were riding on reputation while their competitors rode on innovation. Their century-old company was hemorrhaging relevance, bleeding market share, and desperately needed exactly what Phoenix Innovations had built: cutting-edge technology, visionary leadership, and the kind of innovation that comes from earning your place rather than inheriting it. The partnership they were flying to finalize wasn't a favor they were doing for Phoenix Innovations. It was a lifeline Phoenix was considering throwing to them. The potential $1.2 billion acquisition would give Preston Holdings access to AI systems that could revolutionize their manufacturing processes, bring them into the 21st century, and possibly save thousands of jobs. But their arrogance had blinded them to this reality, just as it was about to blind them to the identity of the woman they were preparing to insult. 16-year-old Logan Preston trailed behind his parents, earbuds in, desperately trying to pretend he wasn't related to the show they were about to put on. Tall and lanky with his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, he wore expensive jeans and a simple black hoodie. His small rebellion against the formal attire his parents preferred. His eyes carried that particular combination of boredom and embarrassment unique to teenagers forced to witness their parents' worst tendencies. Logan represented both the hope that privilege didn't have to poison every generation and the fear that it usually did. He was old enough to see his parents' ugliness, but too young to know how to stop it. Smart enough to feel embarrassed, but not brave enough to speak up. At his private school, he quietly befriended scholarship students his parents would never invite home. Online, he followed social justice accounts and tech innovators from diverse backgrounds. But in person, he remained silent when his parents made comments that made him cringe, trapped in the golden handcuffs of financial dependence and family expectations. As Victoria's sharp eyes immediately locked onto Olivia and Zoe, you could see her expression shift from mild curiosity to barely concealed annoyance. In her world, first class was a sanctuary for the right kind of people, and something about this mother-daughter duo didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in such spaces. Victoria glanced at her husband, expecting him to share her irritation, but Richard remained absorbed in his documents, spreadsheets that showed Preston Holdings' declining market position and the urgent need for Phoenix Innovations technology. "Richard," Victoria whispered sharply, nudging him, "are they letting just anyone into first class these days? Standards really have dropped." Richard grunted noncommittally, too focused on tomorrow's acquisition meeting to engage with his wife's prejudices. Logan removed one earbud long enough to catch his mother's comment, then closed his eyes in silent mortification, turning up his music to drown out whatever might come next. The stage was now set for a collision between two families, two worldviews, and two very different understandings of what truly constitutes value in this world. The flight setup, the first-class cabin of Flight 385, was a study in calculated luxury. 14 seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each offering the illusion of privacy while subtly reinforcing a sense of exclusive community. Soft leather and muted cream tones, polished wood accents, and discreet lighting created an atmosphere that whispered rather than shouted its expense. The air smelled different here, a blend of high-end perfumes, leather conditioner, and that indefinable scent of privilege that seemed to follow wealth wherever it traveled. As passengers settled in, The usual rituals of first-class travel unfolded with choreographed precision. Flight attendants offered pressed hot towels on silver trays. Crystal glasses were filled with champagne or fresh orange juice. Newspapers and magazines were discreetly offered, then tucked away in custom holders. The sounds were different too. Quieter conversations, the gentle clink of real glassware, the soft whoosh of the premium air circulation system that kept this cabin at the perfect temperature while economy passengers would soon be adjusting their plastic air nozzles in vain. Flight attendant Miguel Rivera moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. At 34, he'd been working first-class service on international routes for 8 years, developing an almost supernatural ability to read passengers' needs and personalities within moments of their boarding. He'd served celebrities, politicians, CEOs, and old money families, learning that wealth came in many forms, but true class was always recognizable. "Good morning, Dr. Morgan," he greeted Olivia warmly, his professional smile carrying genuine respect. "And Ms. Morgan, welcome aboard. Can I get you both something to drink before takeoff?" He'd recognized Olivia immediately. Her recent cover on Business Week had highlighted Phoenix Innovations' revolutionary approach to healthcare AI. More importantly, unlike some high-profile passengers, she was known among flight crews for treating staff with consistent respect. "Water for both of us, please," Olivia replied with a smile. "And perhaps an extra pillow for my daughter." Zoe looked up from her book long enough to add, "Thank you, sir," before returning to the story of Katherine Johnson calculating orbital trajectories 3 rows back. Victoria Preston observed this interaction with narrowed eyes, her mouth tightening at what she perceived as excessive familiarity between the flight attendant and these passengers who didn't fit her image of first-class clientele. "Richard," she whispered sharply, nudging her husband, who was already reviewing documents on his tablet. "Standards really have dropped everywhere, haven't they? I remember when this airline was more selective." Richard grunted noncommittally, too absorbed in the acquisition paperwork to engage with his wife's commentary. The documents outlined the terms of what would be Preston Holdings' salvation. A $1.2 billion acquisition by Phoenix Innovations that would inject their struggling company with cutting-edge technology while preserving the Preston name for marketing purposes. The financial projections showed a company on life support being offered a miracle cure, though Richard's pride translated this in his mind as a strategic partnership between equals. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Preston." Miguel greeted them with the same professional courtesy he'd shown Olivia and Zoe. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" "Champagne," Victoria replied without looking up, her tone making it clear she expected nothing less. "The Veuve Clicquot, not whatever domestic substitute you're probably serving now." Miguel's smile never faltered. "Of course, Mrs. Preston, and for you, Mr. Preston." "Scotch, neat," Richard answered, still not looking up from his tablet. Logan, settling into the window seat beside his mother, removed one earbud long enough to say, "Just water, please. Thank you." The thank you earned him a sideways glance from Victoria, who considered excessive politeness to service personnel a sign of weak social boundaries. Logan pretended not to notice. Returning to the podcast he was listening to, ironically, an interview with a tech entrepreneur discussing the democratization of artificial intelligence, the very field where Olivia Morgan had made her billions. As the rest of the first-class cabin filled with passengers, a mix of business travelers, wealthy vacationers, and the occasional upgraded frequent flyer, subtle social hierarchies established themselves through glances, nods, and the careful placement of personal items. Victoria performed her usual ritual of strategic recognition, acknowledging those she deemed worthy with slight nods while remaining studiously oblivious to others. Olivia observed this silent social dance with the detached interest of an anthropologist, having long ago learned to recognize such behaviors without internalizing them. She'd navigated far more challenging environments than a first-class cabin, venture capital boardrooms where she was the only woman of color, tech conferences where she was mistaken for support staff, and industry galas where she was asked to show ID while her white male counterparts walked straight in. Her phone buzzed with a text from her chief operating officer. Board unanimously approved final terms. Preston team still pushing for management transition adjustments. All systems go for tomorrow's signing unless they try last-minute changes. Olivia texted back, "No further concessions?" They need us more than we need them. She added a smiley face to soften the message, then turned her phone to airplane mode. 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 23 hours until the scheduled contract signing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing their flight time to San Francisco. Flight attendants began their safety demonstration as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Zoe briefly looked up from her book to watch the safety procedures. Her mother had taught her to always pay attention, no matter how many times she'd flown, while Victoria ostentatiously continued her conversation with Richard as if the demonstration was beneath her notice. Miguel, completing his pre-flight checks, made a mental note to keep an eye on the Preston family. After 8 years in first class, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble brewing, and something about Victoria's demeanor had triggered warning signals. He'd seen that particular brand of entitlement before, and it rarely ended well for anyone involved. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi toward the runway, no one in the first-class cabin could have predicted how dramatically their lives would intersect in the hours to come, or how a single glass of wine would change everything. Part 2, the confrontation. As Flight 385 reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into the rhythm of long-haul travel. Seatbelts were unbuckled, laptops emerged from designer bags, and the subtle class divisions of air travel became even more pronounced in the rarefied atmosphere of first class. Miguel and his colleague Sophia began preparing for the first meal service, arranging fine china and actual silverware on linen-covered trays. The menu for today's flight offered 3 gourmet options, each paired with premium wine selected by the airline's consultant sommelier. In economy class, passengers would soon be deciding between chicken or pasta. But here in first class, dining was designed to be an experience rather than merely sustenance. Victoria Preston's agitation had been growing steadily since takeoff. What had begun as general displeasure at the presence of people she deemed unsuitable for first class had crystallized into specific irritation focused on the Morgan family. Every time Olivia spoke to Zoe, pointing out something interesting in the clouds or asking what she learned from her book, Victoria's expression tightened. Every time Miguel smiled warmly while serving them, Victoria's eyes narrowed. The mere existence of this mother and daughter in her rarefied space seemed to offend her on a molecular level. "The standards really have fallen," she whispered to Richard, loud enough to be heard by anyone paying attention. "Remember when people dressed properly for first class? When there was a certain quality to the passengers?" Richard, deeply absorbed in acquisition documents, muttered something non-committal. The financial statements in front of him told a story his pride wouldn't fully accept. Preston Holdings' market valuation had dropped 23% in the last year alone. Their manufacturing technologies were becoming obsolete in a rapidly digitalizing world. This acquisition by Phoenix Innovations wasn't just advantageous, it was existential. "Richard, are you listening to me?" Victoria's perfectly manicured nails tapped his tablet screen, forcing him to look up. "What? Yes, of course," he replied automatically, the response of a man who had spent decades in the practice of appearing to listen to his wife. "I was saying that the quality of passengers has declined dramatically," she repeated, with a pointed glance toward Olivia and Zoe. "I don't understand why they let just anyone up here these days. There should be one standards." Logan, who had been pretending to be absorbed in his music, felt his cheeks burn with secondhand embarrassment. He'd endured similar moments throughout his childhood. His mother's commentary on those people at restaurants, her complaints about diversity hires at his father's company, her dismissive remarks about his school scholarship students. Each time, he'd retreated further into silence, finding it easier to disconnect than to challenge beliefs cemented long before he was born. 2 rows ahead, Zoe Morgan turned a page in her book, apparently absorbed in the story of Katherine Johnson calculating orbital trajectories by hand. But her slightly stiffened posture revealed she'd heard every word of Victoria's commentary. Olivia noticed immediately. Mothers develop a sixth sense for their children's discomfort, and gently placed her hand over her daughter's. "What part are you reading now?" she asked quietly. "The part where they won't let Catherine use the white bathroom, even though she's doing calculations that will send astronauts to space," Zoe replied, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing her understanding of the parallel to their current situation. Olivia nodded. "And what did she do about it?" "She used it anyway," Zoe said, a small smile forming. "She said she paid taxes like everyone else, so she had the same right to the bathroom as anyone." "That's right," Olivia confirmed. "Remember what I always tell you, Our dignity isn't determined by other people's opinions of us. Zoe finished, their shared mantra in moments like these. Miguel, who had overheard both conversations while preparing the meal service, managed to maintain his professional demeanor, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his 8 years of serving first class, he'd witnessed countless variations of this scenario. The subtle and not so subtle prejudices, the assumptions, the entitlements. He'd developed a sixth sense for trouble brewing and made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the Preston party. At 12:15 p.m., meal service began. The subtle choreography of high-end airline dining unfolded as tables were set with white cloths, real napkins, and proper place settings. Wine bottles were presented for approval before pouring, a ritual borrowed from fine dining and somewhat absurd in the context of air travel, but one that reinforced the exclusive experience first class promised. Olivia accepted a glass of mineral water with lime, declining the wine. Zoe carefully placed her book aside, making sure to keep it away from any potential spills. The worn copy of Hidden Figures was special, not just any edition, but one signed by Katherine Johnson herself, a treasure Olivia had obtained through a charity auction to inspire her daughter's interest in STEM. 3 rows back, Victoria ordered the most expensive wine on the menu, a French Bordeaux, and made a show of evaluating it with exaggerated expertise. "I suppose it will do, though it's hardly a proper vintage," she announced to Miguel, who thanked her for her assessment with practiced neutrality. Richard ordered the same, more from habit than preference. While continuing to review the acquisition documents, Logan declined alcohol with a quiet, "Just water, please," earning another disapproving glance from his mother, who considered his abstention another sign he wasn't embracing the privileges of his class. As the meal service progressed, the tension in the cabin continued to build, a subtle pressure system forming around the Preston and Morgan families, with Victoria as the unstable, low-pressure center. Her comments grew slightly louder, her gestures more pronounced, her criticisms of everything from the wine temperature to the bread selection more pointed. Other passengers began to notice. A tech entrepreneur in 1A kept glancing over, recognition dawning as he realized he was seated near Olivia Morgan. An older businesswoman in 3D watched the situation with the wary eye of someone who had witnessed similar scenarios unfold. A young couple in 4E and 4F whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with Victoria's increasingly obvious behavior. Through it all, Olivia maintained her composed demeanor, engaging with her daughter about her book, taking occasional notes on her tablet, and treating Miguel and the other flight attendants with consistent respect. It was the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove and knew her worth wasn't dependent on others' validation. This contrast only seemed to irritate Victoria further, like sandpaper against her already raw sense of entitlement. As the main course was served, she accidentally bumped Miguel's arm while he was setting down her plate, then acted as if the near spill was his fault. When Sophia offered freshly ground pepper, Victoria waved her away with, "I assume it's not actually fresh, so why bother?" Richard remained oblivious, his attention focused on the documents that represented Preston Holdings' last hope at remaining relevant. Logan withdrew further into his music. The volume increased to drown out his mother's behavior. And Zoe Morgan, wise beyond her 12 years, observed it all with the quiet assessment of a child who had already learned that some adults never truly grow up. 12:18 p.m., 4 minutes before everything changes. The cabin atmosphere had transformed into something charged and uncomfortable, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. And at 12:15 p.m., as meal service continued, no one yet realized just how powerful the coming tempest would be. The incident at 12:22 p.m., everything changed. The first-class cabin of Flight 385 had settled into the rhythm of meal service. The soft clink of silverware against fine china created a gentle percussion beneath the white noise of the engines. Flight attendants moved efficiently between rows, refilling water glasses and offering bread from a basket lined with linen. Olivia and Zoe Morgan were quietly enjoying their meals, their conversation a mixture of discussion about Zoe's book and plans for their weekend in San Francisco after Olivia's business meetings. Zoe's white blouse remained immaculate. She was a careful eater, something she'd learned from watching her mother navigate business dinners where any small mishap could be used to diminish her professionalism. "After the contract signing tomorrow, I thought we might visit the California Academy of Sciences," Olivia was saying. "They have a new exhibit on women in astronomy that I think you'll..." Her words were interrupted by a commotion 3 rows back. Victoria Preston had stood up suddenly, ostensibly to retrieve something from the overhead compartment. But instead of returning to her seat, she began moving toward the front of the cabin, wineglass in hand, her trajectory bringing her directly past the Morgan seats. What happened next unfolded in what seemed like slow motion to those watching, yet was over in seconds. Victoria paused beside Zoe's seat, her expression a mask of false concern. "Oh dear," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It seems they're letting just anyone into first class these days." Her perfectly manicured hand tilted, and the deep burgundy liquid arced through the pressurized cabin air, seeming to hang suspended for a heartbeat before splashing across Zoe's pristine white blouse and beloved book. The cold wine soaked through the cotton fabric instantly with a shocking chill against Zoe's skin. The acrid smell of expensive Cabernet mixing with the artificial cabin air. The sound of liquid hitting fabric was surprisingly loud in the hushed cabin, a wet slap followed by a collective intake of breath from nearby passengers. Zoe gasped, her body instinctively recoiling as droplets spattered across hidden figures, seeping into the dog-eared pages that contained Katherine Johnson's signature. The white paper began absorbing the wine immediately, the burgundy liquid crawling across the page like blood, the precious autograph blurring as the liquid spread, the metallic scent of the ink dissolving mingled with the fruity notes of the wine, creating a sickly sweet aroma of destruction. The cabin fell silent, that unique, horrified silence that happens when witnessing something so brazenly cruel that even strangers don't know how to respond. Then came the sound of multiple phone camera shutters clicking. In seat 1A, tech entrepreneur Marcus Wilson had begun recording, the elderly passenger in 3D, Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, gasped audibly. Business traveler Sofia Rodriguez in 5B already had her phone out, capturing the moment that was about to go viral. "Oops," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false concern that matched the wine now dripping from Zoe's chin onto her skirt. "Turbulence." But there had been no turbulence. The fasten seatbelt sign was off. The flight was smooth. Every passenger and crew member in the cabin knew exactly what they had just witnessed, a deliberate act of cruelty directed at a child. Miguel froze momentarily, water pitcher suspended mid-pour at another passenger's seat, his professional training temporarily overridden by shock at the blatant hostility of the act. Sophia immediately grabbed napkins and began moving towards Zoe, her face a professional mask barely concealing her outrage. In her seat, Zoe Morgan remained perfectly still, wine dripping from her chin onto her lap. Her eyes were wide with shock, but remarkably, there were no tears, only a deep hurt and confusion that was painful to witness. Her hands still held her now ruined book, fingers trembling slightly as she watched the precious signature dissolve into an unrecognizable smear. The white blouse now bore a spreading Rorschach test of burgundy, the stains seeping outward in real time. Olivia's reaction was immediate but measured. She didn't jump up shouting. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she calmly placed her napkin in her lap, took a deep breath, and then slowly turned to face Victoria Preston with the kind of gaze that had made tech billionaires and venture capitalists reconsider their positions during negotiations. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but carrying that unmistakable quality of authority that commanded attention. "You've just intentionally poured wine on my daughter and ruined a book of significant personal value." Victoria's expression flickered, perhaps the first indication that she hadn't anticipated such a composed response. She had expected tears, angry shouting, or embarrassed retreating, reactions that would have confirmed her worldview and allowed her to play the victim if challenged. Olivia's calm dignity wasn't in her script. "It was an accident," Victoria replied, the lie transparent to everyone watching. "Perhaps your daughter shouldn't have such valuable things in a public space if she can't protect them." From his seat, Richard Preston finally looked up from his documents, the commotion finally penetrating his concentration. His face paled as he registered what was happening, his eyes darting between his wife, the wine-soaked child, and the mother who was now standing to her full height. Logan Preston pulled his earbuds out, his face flushing with the mortification as he realized what his mother had done. "Mom," he whispered urgently. "Mom, stop. Please." But Victoria was committed to her performance now. "These things happen," she continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension reserved for those she considered beneath her. Maybe next time you'll book more appropriate accommodations for your situation. The implied meaning hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. More phones were recording now. The elderly Mrs. Caldwell was shaking her head in clear disapproval. Miguel had set down his pitcher and was approaching with a stack of clean napkins and a serious expression. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, his professional tone masking his anger, "I need to ask you to return to your seat immediately." "I was just trying to reach the lavatory," Victoria replied, the lie becoming more elaborate. If they hadn't placed so many people in this cabin, there would be room to move properly. As Miguel guided Victoria back toward her seat, Sophia arrived with napkins and a concerned expression. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly to Zoe. "Let me help you clean up." Zoe's composure finally cracked, not with tears but with a small, shaky voice that revealed her youth despite her dignity. "The book," she said. "It was signed by Katherine Johnson. It was special." The heartbreak in her voice was palpable. Several passengers watching visibly winced. The young couple in 4E and 4F exchanged horrified glances. The stain continued to spread, the wine creating dark rivers between the pages, turning words and images into a blurred mess of purple-stained pulp. The book that had survived decades, that bore the signature of a pioneering mathematician who had overcome immeasurable barriers, was being destroyed before their eyes by a casual act of cruelty. As Olivia helped her daughter blot the worst of the wine from her clothing, she maintained her composed demeanor, but those watching closely could see the controlled fury in her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw. This wasn't just a ruined blouse or even a damaged book. This was an attack on her child's dignity, a moment that would stay with Zoe long after the wine stain faded. Meanwhile, Richard Preston had finally grasped the situation and was attempting damage control. "Victoria," he hissed as she returned to their row. "What were you thinking?" But Victoria, still riding the high of her perceived power play, merely shrugged. "I was just walking to the bathroom." "Richard, accidents happen." The elderly Mrs. Caldwell, who had been watching the entire incident unfold, spoke up unexpectedly. "Young lady," she said, her refined voice carrying decades of authority, "in my 82 years, I have never witnessed such deliberate unkindness to a child. You should be ashamed of yourself." Victoria's face flushed, not with shame but with indignation at being challenged. "Mind your own business," she snapped, forgetting her usual veneer of politeness to those she considered peers. At 12:25 p.m., 7 minutes into the incident, the first video was uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "Racist Karen pours wine on black girl in first class, #racism, #first class, #airlines." Within seconds, it began accumulating views. The coppery tang of adrenaline filled the air, mixing with the smell of wine and the artificial scent of recycled cabin air. Tension vibrated through the cabin like a plucked string. In seat after seat, passengers shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes from the ugly display of prejudice, others watching with the helpless fascination of witnesses to a car crash. As Miguel and Sophia attended to the Morgans, offering wet towels and apologies, the rest of the first-class cabin watched with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something significant, a small moment of cruelty that would soon have consequences far beyond what anyone, especially Victoria Preston, could have anticipated. Logan Preston, unable to bear his embarrassment any longer, stood up suddenly. "I'm going to the bathroom," he muttered, squeezing past his mother and practically fleeing to the lavatory at the front of the cabin. As he passed the Morgan seats, his eyes briefly met Zoe's, a fleeting moment of silent apology before he disappeared behind the lavatory door. At 12:27 p.m., 3 minutes into what would later be known across social media as the first-class incident, all the players were in position for the confrontation that would change their lives forever. Olivia's response. Olivia Morgan didn't raise her voice. She never had to. 20 years of commanding boardroom, filled with men who underestimated her, had taught her that power doesn't shout. It simply exists. She stood slowly, her full height making her presence felt throughout the cabin. The first-class section had gone eerily quiet, the normal ambient sounds of flight seeming to fade as passengers and crew alike sensed a pivotal moment unfolding. Even the engines seemed to hum at a lower pitch, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Olivia reached into her Hermes handbag, not the knockoff Victoria had assumed, but the limited edition that had been a gift from the company's CEO after Olivia's technology revitalized their global supply chain. From it, she withdrew a business card and a crisp handkerchief embroidered with her initials. "My daughter," Olivia began, her voice carrying that perfect blend of warmth and authority that had made her TED Talk the most viewed leadership presentation in the platform's history. "We'll accept your apology now. Not a request, a statement of fact, a recalibration of the power dynamic that left no room for debate." Victoria blinked rapidly, unprepared for this response. Her privilege had trained her to expect either angry retaliation she could dismiss as aggression or silent submission she could interpret as weakness. Olivia's calm dignity offered neither, leaving Victoria suddenly scriptless in a scene she thought she was directing. I don't," Victoria stammered, looking desperately toward Richard for support. "Let me be clear," Olivia continued, placing her business card deliberately on Victoria's armrest. The embossed lettering caught the cabin light. "Dr. Olivia Morgan, founder and CEO, Phoenix Innovations. That book you've ruined has been signed by Katherine Johnson herself, one of the NASA mathematicians who helped put America in space while fighting prejudice, not unlike what you've displayed today. Its value is considerable, but not nearly as valuable as the lesson my daughter is learning right now." Olivia's eyes moved to Zoe, communicating volumes without words. "She's learning that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time." Olivia's gaze returned to Victoria. "And act accordingly." Victoria's expression cycled through confusion, then disbelief, then the first flickers of genuine fear as she looked down at the business card and recognition finally hit her. You're Olivia Morgan." "Morgan," Olivia corrected gently, the small insistence on her earned title speaking volumes. Realization rippled through the cabin as other passengers made the connection. The tech entrepreneur in seat 1A leaned forward, his recording continuing uninterrupted. The elderly Mrs. Caldwell nodded in sudden understanding. Miguel and Sophia exchanged meaningful glances, now comprehending the full magnitude of Victoria's mistake. "But you're the CEO of Phoenix," Victoria said, her voice suddenly smaller. "You're the one Richard is meeting tomorrow for the acquisition." Olivia finished for her. "Yes, that's correct. Your husband's company, Preston Holdings, has been in talks with my team about a potential $1.2 billion acquisition. The final contracts were scheduled for signing tomorrow morning." The calculated use of past tense, "were scheduled," hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Richard Preston stood up abruptly, finally finding his voice. "Dr. Morgan, I cannot apologize enough for this unfortunate incident. My wife was clearly not aware of who you were, and I'm sure we can—" "Mr. Preston," Olivia interrupted, her tone polite but firm. "With respect, that's precisely the problem. Your wife's behavior wouldn't be acceptable regardless of who my daughter and I are. The fact that her treatment changes once she recognizes me as someone of professional consequence, rather than simply another human being worthy of basic dignity, that tells me everything I need to know about the values that drive your family and, by extension, your company." Victoria's face had drained of all color. The implications were beginning to sink in. Not just social embarrassment, but potential financial catastrophe. "It was an accident." She tried again, the lie sounding hollow even to her own ears. "No, Mrs. Preston, it was a choice," Olivia replied, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the entire cabin. "And choices have consequences. You chose to pour wine on a child because her mere presence offended your sense of entitlement. You chose to destroy a book that meant something to her. You chose to lie about it afterward. These aren't accidents. They're deliberate decisions that reveal character." The quiet force of Olivia's words seemed to physically push Victoria back into her seat. Several passengers nodded in agreement. The young couple in 4E and 4F were still recording, their phones capturing every word of what was quickly becoming a masterclass in dignified response to provocation. Olivia turned her attention to Miguel, who was standing nearby with professional concern. "I'd like to request a change of seats for my daughter and myself, please. And I'll need the contact information for your airline's legal department regarding the destruction of personal property." Miguel nodded immediately. "Of course, Dr. Morgan, We have seats available at the front of the cabin. I'll make those arrangements immediately and provide the necessary contact information. Throughout this exchange, Zoe had been quietly attempting to salvage what she could of her book, carefully blotting the pages with napkins. Her white blouse was stained beyond repair, the burgundy splash forming an irregular pattern across the cotton fabric. But her composure remained intact, a young girl displaying more maturity than the grown woman who had assaulted her. As Miguel began the process of relocating the Morgans to the front of the cabin, Olivia turned to her daughter. "Zoe, are you all right? Do you need anything else right now?" Zoe looked up at her mother, then briefly at Victoria, who was now being quietly but intensely berated by her husband. "I'm okay, Mom," she said, her voice steadier now. "It's just a shirt and a book. Those can be replaced." Olivia smiled with pride at her daughter's perspective, though the pain of seeing the treasured book destroyed was visible in her eyes. "That's right. And do you remember what we always say about moments like these?" Zoe nodded, gathering her things as they prepared to move seats. "Our dignity isn't determined by other people's opinions of us. It's determined by how we respond when tested." As they moved to their new seats at the front of the cabin, several passengers nodded respectfully at them. The tech entrepreneur in 1A, Marcus Wilson, founder of a successful data security company, caught Olivia's eye and gave her a subtle thumbs up. Mrs. Caldwell reached out to briefly touch Zoe's arm in a gesture of grandmotherly support as they passed her seat. Behind them, the Preston family tableau was dissolving into crisis. Richard was simultaneously trying to manage his panicking wife, text his executive team, and formulate some way to salvage the acquisition that now hung by a thread. Victoria had progressed from denial to bargaining, already trying to formulate ways to minimize and excuse her behavior. And Logan, returning from the lavatory to find the situation had escalated dramatically in his absence, slumped back into his seat with the defeated posture of someone watching a long-anticipated disaster finally unfold. "I told you," he whispered to his mother, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I told you that someday your behavior would have consequences." It was the most direct challenge he had ever issued to either parent, and the shock on both their faces showed they recognized the seismic shift it represented. Their son, the natural inheritor of their privilege, was publicly aligning himself against their values. At 12:35 p.m., just 13 minutes after Victoria Preston's wine glass had tilted, the power dynamic in the first-class cabin of Flight 385 had been completely reversed. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate had instead revealed the true character of everyone involved. And as Olivia Morgan helped her daughter settle into their new seats, her phone began buzzing with notifications. The first tremors of a social media earthquake that was about to change all their lives forever. Immediate aftermath. The first-class cabin of Flight 385 had divided into two distinct territories, the front section, where the Morgans were now settled and receiving discreet but attentive service from Miguel and Sophia, and the back section, where the Preston family crisis was unfolding in increasingly frantic whispers and hissed accusations. Victoria Preston's initial shock had given way to desperate damage control. "Richard, do something," she urged, her voice pitched low but intense. "Call someone. Use your connections. This cannot be happening." Richard's face had taken on the gray pallor of a man watching his company's future dissolve before his eyes. "What exactly would you like me to do, Victoria?" he responded, his voice tightly controlled but vibrating with fury. "You just poured wine on the daughter of the woman who was about to save our company, the woman whose technology we desperately need, the woman who could have preserved your precious lifestyle for another generation. How was I supposed to know who she was?" Victoria hissed back. "You weren't," Richard replied, his voice dropping even lower. "You were supposed to be a decent human being, regardless of who she was. That's the point she was making. And she's right." This assessment, coming from her husband, who had spent decades accommodating her prejudices, seemed to shock Victoria more than Olivia's response had. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. Logan sat silently beside them, his face burning with shame, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, where social media was already beginning to light up with videos of the incident. Hashtag first-class disrespect was trending. The first uploads had already garnered thousands of views and shares. Comments were pouring in, most expressing outrage at Victoria's behavior and admiration for Olivia and Zoe's dignified response. Did you see what she just did to that black child? OMG, that poor girl's face when her book got ruined. The mom's response is everything. This Karen's about to find out actions have consequences. At the front of the cabin, Olivia was on her phone, which had been buzzing continuously since the incident. Her executive team had already been alerted to the situation. The perils and powers of a connected world meant that videos were reaching her company's communications department in real time. Yes, James, I'm aware it's going viral, she said quietly to her chief communications officer. No statement at this time. Let's see how it unfolds. Yes, Zoe is fine, shaken but handling it with her usual grace. No, I haven't made a final decision about tomorrow's signing yet. Let's prepare contingencies for both scenarios. Beside her, Zoe was still attempting to salvage what she could of her book. Sophia had brought her a plastic bag for the worst of the wine-soaked napkins and a club soda to try on the stains. The signature page was beyond repair. Katherine Johnson's elegant handwriting, now a purple-tinged blur. But some of the pages were still readable. I'm sorry about your book, Sophia said gently as she helped Zoe. Was it very special to you? Zoe nodded, carefully separating pages that had stuck together. My mom got it signed for me last year. Katherine Johnson was my hero even before I read about her. Mom always says that women like her paved the way for women like us. Sophia smiled, impressed by the young girl's composure. Your mom seems like a remarkable woman. She is, Zoe agreed simply. That's why I wasn't scared. I knew Mom would handle it. Across the aisle, Marcus Wilson was quietly uploading his video footage to multiple platforms. As the founder of a data security company, he understood better than most how quickly digital content could spread and the impact it could have. His caption was straightforward, but impactful. Watch tech CEO Olivia Morgan handle racist attack on her daughter with incredible class. This is what real leadership looks like. Hashtag Olivia Morgan. Hashtag Phoenix Rising. Hashtag Class Over Cruelty. The elderly Mrs. Caldwell had moved seats to be closer to the Morgans, ostensibly to use the lavatory but really to offer her support. As she passed their row, she paused. Young lady, she said to Zoe, you handled that situation with remarkable poise. Your mother has clearly raised you well. Zoe smiled shyly. Thank you, ma'am. And Dr. Morgan, Mrs. Caldwell continued, turning to Olivia, I've followed your career for some time. My late husband was on the board of a hospital that implemented your diagnostic AI. It saved countless lives. I'm sorry you and your daughter experienced such treatment today. Olivia thanked her with genuine warmth, the brief interaction representing the kind of respectful engagement that should have been the norm rather than the exception. Meanwhile, Richard Preston had excused himself to the lavatory, where he was making frantic phone calls to his executive team. The videos were spreading across business networks now, and Preston Holdings investors were already reaching out with concerned inquiries. The company's stock, which had been artificially maintained by acquisition rumors, would likely plummet when markets opened the next day. When he returned to his seat, his expression was grim. The board is convening an emergency meeting, he informed Victoria, his voice barely audible. There's already talk of asking for my resignation if the deal falls through. Victoria's perfectly maintained facade finally cracked completely. Over a spilled drink, she whispered incredulously. This is absurd. It was an accident. It wasn't an accident, Logan suddenly interjected, his voice quiet but clear. Everyone saw what you did, Mom. Everyone knows it was on purpose. Victoria turned to her son with shocked betrayal. Logan, how dare you how dare I what? Tell the truth. Logan's face was flushed with emotion he rarely displayed. You've been making comments about them since we boarded. You deliberately walked by their seats. You poured wine on a kid because of how she looked. And now there are like 20 videos of it all over the internet. He held up his phone to show her a TikTok that had already accumulated over 100,000 views in less than 30 minutes. The comments section was a firestorm of outrage directed at Victoria. TikTok's youngest millionaire says, this is what privilege looks like when it feels threatened. Celebrity chef commenting, I've seen this woman at my restaurant, always awful to staff, especially POC. Thread, the Preston family has a history of this behavior. My mom cleaned their house in the 90s. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Victoria Preston found herself truly speechless, confronted with a reality she could neither deny nor control. Her actions, normally contained within circles that would excuse or ignore them, had been exposed to the wider world, where different standards applied. The privileged bubble she had inhabited was bursting in real time. At the front of the cabin, and Olivia was now speaking with her daughter in quiet tones. "I want you to know that I'm incredibly proud of how you've handled this," she told Zoe. "Many adults wouldn't have shown the grace you've displayed today." Zoe looked up from her damaged book. "Are you going to cancel the deal with that man's company?" Olivia considered the question seriously, respecting her daughter's intelligence enough to engage with the complexities of the situation. "I haven't decided yet. There are many factors to consider: people's jobs, the technology's potential benefits, our investors' interests, but also our dignity," Zoe added. Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, always that." The contrast between the two families couldn't have been more stark. The Morgans, despite being the targets of an ugly attack, were calmly discussing complex ethical considerations, their relationship strengthened by shared values and mutual respect. The Prestons, who had initiated the conflict from a position of assumed superiority, were now fracturing under the pressure of accountability, their relationship strained by long-simmering tensions suddenly exposed. By 12:50 p.m., 30 minutes after the incident, Flight 385 had become the epicenter of a story radiating outward at digital speed. What had begun as a cruel impulse by one privileged woman was transforming into a case study in consequences that would be analyzed in business schools, discussed on news programs, and debated across social media platforms for months to come. As the plane continued its journey westward, no one in the first-class cabin could yet comprehend how completely their lives would be transformed by the time they landed. But as Olivia Morgan's phone continued to light up with notifications, and Richard Preston's continued to deliver increasingly panicked messages from his executive team, the first tremors of that transformation were already being felt. Part 3, the digital explosion. By 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, just 50 minutes after Victoria Preston had poured wine on Zoe Morgan, the digital wildfire was spreading at an unprecedented rate. What had begun as a few passenger videos had morphed into a multi-platform phenomenon that was breaking through the normal boundaries of social media communities and reaching mainstream awareness. The original TikTok video, posted by business traveler Sofia Rodriguez with the caption, "Racist Karen pours wine on black girl in first class #racism, #first class, #airlines," had already accumulated 2.3 million views and was doubling every 15 minutes. The platform's algorithm, recognizing the high engagement rate, had pushed it to the For You pages of millions of users, expanding its reach beyond Sophia's normal followers. Twitter, now X, was ablaze with multiple trending hashtags, #first-class-disrespect, 117,000 tweets in the past hour, #Olivia Morgan, 89,000 tweets. Trending number 3 nationwide, #Phoenix Rising, 64,000 tweets. Primarily in tech and business communities, #WineLady, 53,000 tweets. Quickly becoming shorthand for Victoria, #Boycott Preston, 41,000 tweets. Focused on business implications. Marcus Wilson's video, with its focus on Olivia's leadership response rather than Victoria's aggression, had particularly resonated with business and tech communities. His post had been shared by several tech influencers and venture capitalists, many adding comments about Olivia's known reputation for grace under pressure. Prominent venture capitalist Oriana Mendez had quote tweeted the video with, "This is why Olivia Morgan is the most respected CEO in tech, turning a racist attack into a leadership masterclass. Watch and learn. People, this is how you handle a crisis with dignity. #Phoenix Rising." Instagram stories were filled with reposts of the videos, often accompanied by personal reflections from users who had experienced similar treatment in predominantly white spaces. Black professionals in particular were sharing the content widely. Many with comments like, "Watch how Dr. Morgan maintains her composure while advocating for her daughter. This is what we mean by the emotional labor of existing in hostile environments." Celebrity responses were amplifying the reach exponentially. Basketball superstar Marcus Johnson posted, "Watching Dr. Morgan defend her daughter with such dignity reminds me of how my own mother protected me from racism before I was famous enough for people to pretend it doesn't exist. #This is America." Popular talk show host Elena Rodriguez wrote, "As a mother, my heart breaks for what this young girl experienced. As a professional woman of color, I stand in awe of Dr. Morgan's response. This is a masterclass in turning hatred into teachable moments. Even the normally apolitical pop star Zara Williams weighed in. What kind of person pours wine on a child? Morgan is my new hero for how she handled this. Sending love to her daughter. Hashtag Phoenix Rising. Back on flight 385, the online explosion was manifesting in real time on passengers' devices. Those with in-flight Wi-Fi were witnessing the incident they just observed transform into a cultural moment. Several were themselves contributing to the narrative, adding context or additional footage from different angles. The tech entrepreneur Marcus Wilson, seated in 1A, had become an impromptu commentator. Sharing updates from the flight, Dr. Morgan and her daughter have moved seats and are handling this with incredible grace. The airline staff have been supportive. The woman who poured the wine is now frantically on her phone, probably watching her actions go viral in real time. Justice via social media is swift. Hashtag Phoenix Rising. His live updates were being reshared by tech media outlets, creating a real-time narrative that felt like watching a documentary unfold. Marcus Wilson's play-by-play of the hashtag first-class disrespect fallout is better than any reality show, commented one tech blog editor with 1.2 million followers. In the Preston family row, Logan was watching the unfolding digital drama with a mixture of horror and validation. For years, he had silently witnessed his mother's behavior in private settings, the casual racism, the entitlement, the disdain for those she considered beneath her. Now, for the first time, she was facing public accountability, and part of him felt a guilty relief that the world was finally seeing what he had always known. Victoria herself had progressed from denial to panic. Her perfectly maintained appearance was beginning to crack, a strand of hair falling out of place, her makeup slightly smudged from repeated touching of her face, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the tsunami of condemnation flooding social media. "They're using my name," she whispered in horror to Richard. "How do they know who I am? Where are they getting this information?" Richard, who had been fielding increasingly alarmed messages from Preston Holdings board members, barely looked up from his phone. "It's 2025, Victoria. People can identify anyone in minutes. Your photos are all over our company website, our charity foundation page, your country club's member directory. Did you think you were anonymous?" Indeed, internet sleuths had already compiled Victoria Preston's digital footprint into damning collages being shared across platforms. Her previous racist comments on community forums, her tone-deaf Instagram posts about her household staff, her Facebook complaints about diversity initiatives at Logan's school, all were being exhumed and displayed alongside the fresh video evidence of her character. A Twitter thread titled "Victoria Preston, A History of Entitlement" had already accumulated 37,000 retweets, with screenshots of her past social media activity demonstrating a pattern of behavior consistent with what the world had just witnessed on Flight 385. News organizations were now picking up the story. Business Insider had published a breaking news piece titled "Phoenix Innovations CEO Faces Racist Incident Hours Before Billion-Dollar Acquisition Signing." The article connected the dots quickly, explaining the business context that made this more than just another viral Karen video. Sources close to the negotiations confirmed that Phoenix Innovations was set to acquire Preston Holdings in a deal worth approximately $1.2 billion. The acquisition, which would have injected Preston's manufacturing business with Phoenix's cutting-edge AI technology, was scheduled for final signing tomorrow morning. Industry analysts are now speculating whether the deal will proceed after this highly public incident involving the Preston family. CNBC had broken into regular programming with "Breaking Phoenix Preston Acquisition Potentially in Jeopardy After Viral Incident." Preston Holdings stock futures already showing significant pre-market movement. The chyron at the bottom of the screen displayed the real-time stock movement, PRH 73% in extended hours, trading as acquisition questions emerge. At the front of the cabin, Olivia Morgan was handling the situation with characteristic strategic thinking. Rather than making impulsive statements or feeding the online frenzy, she was carefully considering her response from multiple angles: personal, professional, and societal. "James," she said quietly into her phone, speaking to her chief communications officer, "I want our statement to be measured. No inflammatory language. Focus on our commitment to dignity and respect as core values, both personally and as a company. Make it clear that business decisions are made based on alignment of values as well as financial considerations. She paused, listening to his response. Yes, mention Zoe, but keep it brief. She's a minor, and while I won't hide what happened, I don't want her to become the center of a media circus. Right, exactly. And prepare 2 press releases regarding Preston Holdings. One announcing we're proceeding with the acquisition as planned, one announcing we're terminating discussions. I'll make the final decision before we land. Beside her, Zoe was reading the still salvageable portions of her book, seemingly detached from the digital storm swirling around her. But occasionally, she would glance at her mother's phone and take in the magnitude of what was happening. At one point, she asked quietly, "Mom, are we famous now?" Olivia smiled gently. "Not us, sweetheart. The situation? There's a difference. This will pass, and what matters is how we handle ourselves through it." But even as she reassured her daughter, Olivia was acutely aware that some moments fundamentally altered trajectories. As a Black woman who had navigated the overwhelmingly white and male world of tech leadership, she had experienced countless microaggressions and overt discriminations. Most had gone unchallenged publicly, addressed instead through her persistent excellence and strategic choices about which battles to fight. This time was different. This time, her daughter had been targeted. This time, there was video evidence. This time, the world was watching. And as both a mother and a CEO, Olivia recognized her response would send messages far beyond the immediate situation. Messages about dignity, consequences, and the true nature of power. By 1:30 p.m., the incident had transcended standard viral content to become a cultural inflection point, a moment when private prejudice, public accountability, corporate values, and personal dignity collided at 35,000 feet, with millions of people watching in real time. A TikTok analytics dashboard displayed the staggering engagement metrics: 7 million views across multiple uploads, 824,000 shares, 1.3 million comments, and an engagement rate of 28.4%, nearly triple the platform average for viral content. The hashtag first-class disrespect had officially entered the cultural lexicon, a shorthand for entitlement confronted by dignity that would resonate long after the specific details of Flight 385 had faded from memory. As Flight 385 continued westward, the digital ripples were transforming into tidal waves that would soon reach shores far beyond social media. Business world reaction. By 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 hours after the incident, the business world was fully engaged with the unfolding drama aboard Flight 385. What might have once remained a private altercation with limited consequences had transformed, in the digital age, into a case study of how personal conduct can impact corporate futures in real time. Preston Holdings stock, which traded on the NYSE under the symbol PRH, had begun an alarming decline in pre-market trading. Although regular trading hours wouldn't begin until the next morning, the after-hours indicators were flashing red, down 7.3% and continuing to fall as institutional investors positioned themselves ahead of what many anticipated would be a disastrous opening bell if the Phoenix acquisition collapsed. Financial news networks had pivoted to full coverage of the story, with split screens showing the viral video alongside stock tickers and expert panels debating the business implications. CNBC had assembled a roundtable of corporate governance specialists, crisis management experts, and investment analysts to dissect the situation. What we're witnessing is unprecedented in acquisition dynamics, explained financial analyst Dr. Samantha Rodriguez on Bloomberg TV. Social factors have always influenced business decisions, but rarely have we seen such a direct, public connection between personal conduct and a billion-dollar deal. Preston Holdings was already in a vulnerable position, with their legacy manufacturing technology rapidly becoming obsolete. They needed Phoenix innovations far more than Phoenix needed them. The segment cut to a graph showing Preston Holdings' declining revenue over 5 consecutive quarters, contrasted with Phoenix Innovations' exponential growth during the same period. The market is reacting not just to the potential loss of the acquisition, Dr. Rodriguez continued, but to what this reveals about Preston's corporate culture. If this is how the family that controls the company behaves in public, investors are questioning what the internal culture must be like, and whether such a company can survive in today's business landscape where ESG considerations are increasingly central to investment decisions. A ticker at the bottom of the screen displayed key financial metrics. Preston Holdings PRHU 7.8% in extended hours. Volume 3.2x normal. Phoenix Innovations PHX 0.4%, stabilizing after initial volatility. S&P 500 future 0.1%, indicating limited broader market impact. On Richard Preston's phone, the messages from board members and major investors had evolved from concerned inquiries to panic-driven demands. The most recent text from board chairman William Thompson read simply, "Fix this immediately or resign before markets open tomorrow." His executive team had arranged an emergency virtual board meeting for 4 p.m. Eastern, giving him less than 2 hours to develop some strategy for damage control. The company's general counsel had already drafted a formal apology statement, but legal advisors were warning that releasing it without Dr. Morgan's approval might exacerbate the situation. Meanwhile, Phoenix Innovations was experiencing the opposite effect. While their stock had initially shown slight volatility when news of the incident first broke, reflecting market uncertainty about the acquisition, it had stabilized and was now trending upward as financial analysts speculated that walking away from Preston Holdings might actually be in Phoenix's best interest. Phoenix has always positioned itself as a company with strong ethical foundations. Noted investment strategist Michael Chang on Fox Business. Dr. Morgan built the company around principles of inclusion and forward-thinking leadership. The market is recognizing that her response to this incident actually reinforces the Phoenix brand rather than damaging it. In fact, we're seeing increased investor interest based on the leadership qualities Dr. Morgan displayed in this crisis. Indeed, Phoenix's investor relations department was fielding calls from several institutional investors who had previously been on the fence about increasing their positions. The company's commitment to values-based leadership, now dramatically demonstrated in real time, was proving to be not just morally sound, but financially advantageous. In Silicon Valley, tech leaders were rallying around Olivia Morgan with unprecedented solidarity. The usually competitive tech ecosystem, where rivalries and poaching were commonplace, had temporarily united in support of a leader they respected, facing a situation many of them had experienced in different forms. TechCrunch published an article featuring statements from 17 tech CEOs, all expressing support for Olivia and condemning the treatment of her daughter. The piece noted that 3 companies that had been considering partnerships with Preston Holdings subsidiaries had already announced they were suspending negotiations pending review of the situation. This incident has forced a necessary conversation about the intersection of personal conduct and corporate governance, said Jasmine Lin, CEO of a prominent AI ethics organization. Companies can no longer separate leadership character from business operations. Dr. Morgan is modeling what principled leadership looks like in this industry. On Flight 385, Richard Preston's phone buzzed with a notification that made his blood run cold. Preston Holdings' largest client, Aerospace Dynamics International, had issued a public statement. In light of recent events involving the Preston family, Aerospace Dynamics International is reviewing our ongoing contracts with Preston Holdings. While we value our long-standing relationship, our corporate values require that we partner with companies demonstrating a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion both in policy and in practice. We will be meeting with Preston Holdings leadership to discuss these concerns before renewing our contracts next quarter. The potential loss of the ADI account, which represented 23% of Preston Holdings' annual renewal revenue, would be catastrophic even without the Phoenix acquisition falling through. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the full weight of the crisis finally hitting him. This wasn't just about a social media embarrassment or a failed acquisition. This was potentially about the end of a company that had been in his family for 3 generations. Victoria, still scrolling through the tsunami of outrage directed at her across platforms, hadn't yet grasped the business implications. "These people don't even know me," she kept muttering, genuinely bewildered by the intensity of the response. How can they judge me based on one moment? Logan, who had been silently watching both the social media reaction and his parents' responses to it, finally spoke. "It wasn't one moment, Mom. It's who you've always been. People are just seeing it for the first time." The simple truth in his statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. For a brief moment, the carefully constructed narrative she'd built about herself, the charitable socialite, the perfect corporate wife, the community leader, cracked enough for her to glimpse an alternative perspective of her life and choices. At the front of the cabin, Olivia was simultaneously managing multiple aspects of the crisis with remarkable composure. Her chief financial officer had sent an analysis of the financial implications of canceling the Preston acquisition, including alternative companies they might target instead. Her legal team had provided a preliminary assessment of whether they could withdraw from the agreement without penalty, given the circumstances. Her board chair had expressed full support for whatever decision she felt was appropriate. The numbers support either path forward, her CFO concluded in his message. Preston's manufacturing capacity would accelerate our hardware development by approximately 18 months. But there are alternatives that wouldn't come with the baggage this acquisition now carries. The decision ultimately hinges on non-financial factors. Non-financial factors. The phrase crystallized the essence of the choice before her. As both a mother and a CEO, Olivia had always recognized that true leadership transcended balance sheets and quarterly projections. The culture of a company, its values, its integrity, its treatment of people, ultimately determined its long-term success more than any single business deal. As she looked at Zoe, still quietly reading her wine-stained book beside him, Olivia felt a clarity that transcended business strategy. This wasn't just about an acquisition anymore. This was about what Phoenix Innovation stood for and what kind of world she wanted her daughter to inherit. By 2:45 p.m., with flight 385 still hours from landing, the business implications of Victoria Preston's impulsive cruelty had expanded far beyond anything she could have imagined when she tilted that wine glass. What had begun as a moment of entitlement was transforming into a case study in how personal conduct, corporate values, and social accountability intersect in the digital age, a lesson that would soon be taught in business schools around the world. Landing and separation at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time, Flight 385 began its final descent into San Francisco International Airport. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing local weather conditions and thanking passengers for flying with them. The standard script jarringly normal against the extraordinary circumstances that had unfolded in the first-class cabin. The atmosphere within that cabin had evolved into something unlike anything Miguel had experienced in his years of service. The usual pre-landing routines, tray tables stowed, seats upright, last-minute bathroom visits, were performed against a backdrop of palpable tension, furtive glances, and the quiet tapping of messages being sent before devices needed to be switched to airplane mode. The cabin had essentially divided into factions. Around the Morgans at the front, there was a protective energy, with nearby passengers offering small gestures of support, a sympathetic smile, a quiet word of encouragement, or simply a respectful nod. The tech entrepreneur Marcus Wilson had discreetly passed his business card to Olivia with a handwritten note. Your handling of this situation was masterful. If you ever need a friendly voice in tech to speak up about this incident, count me in. Around the Prestons, there was a chilly isolation, with other passengers deliberately avoiding eye contact or conversation. Victoria, who had finally grasped the magnitude of what was happening, sat in uncharacteristic silence. Her normally perfect posture now slumped slightly. Richard continued working his phone frantically until the very last moment, trying to salvage what he could of his company's future. Logan had put his earbuds back in, retreating into music as his family crisis unfolded beside him. As the aircraft touched down with a gentle bump and the engine's reverse thrust, Miguel moved to the front of the cabin to make a discreet announcement to Olivia and Zoe. Morgan, he said quietly, leaning down to ensure privacy. The airline would like to offer you and your daughter priority deplaning. We also have a representative from our customer service team waiting to assist you in the terminal if you'd like. Olivia considered this for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Miguel. I appreciate the consideration. Sophia appeared with Zoe's backpack, which had been carefully cleaned of wine droplets. I managed to remove most of the stains, she said kindly to Zoe. I'm so sorry about your book, though. Zoe accepted her bag with a small smile. Thank you for trying. My mom says sometimes the most important things can't be erased, even if you can't see them anymore. The wisdom in the child's statement wasn't lost on Sophia, whose eyes momentarily glistened with emotion. Your mom sounds very wise. As the aircraft pulled up to the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Miguel stood at the front of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 12:50 p.m. For the comfort and convenience of all passengers, we ask that you remain seated until your row is ready to deplane. We'll begin with our passengers in the first few rows. This normal procedure had been subtly adapted to allow the Morgans to exit first, creating a buffer between them and the Prestons. As Olivia and Zoe gathered their belongings and moved toward the exit, passengers throughout the cabin watched with a mixture of sympathy and respect. Dr. Morgan, the elderly Mrs. Caldwell, called softly as they passed, "I do hope that someday your daughter will write her own story about the women who changed the world. I think she has quite a chapter to contribute already." Olivia smiled warmly at the older woman. "Thank you. I believe she does too." As they reached the aircraft door, the captain himself had emerged from the cockpit to offer a personal apology. "Dr. Morgan, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to express our sincere regret for what occurred on our flight today. It's not representative of the experience we strive to provide." "Thank you, Captain," Olivia replied graciously. "Your crew handled a difficult situation with professionalism, particularly Miguel and Sophia." The acknowledgement of his team brought a grateful smile to the captain's face. "Safe travels in San Francisco, and please let us know if there's anything else we can do." As Olivia and Zoe stepped into the jetway, they were met by the airline's San Francisco customer service director and a member of their executive team who had been dispatched to the airport specifically to address the situation. This level of response, unusual even for a first-class passenger, was a clear indication of how seriously the airline was taking the incident, aware of both the PR implications and the genuine need to make things right. Meanwhile, back on the aircraft, the Prestons remained seated as other passengers began to deplane. Richard had received instructions from Preston Holdings' crisis management team to avoid any further public interaction with the Morgans that might be recorded or witnessed. The plan was to allow sufficient time for Olivia and Zoe to clear the terminal before the Prestons deplaned. Victoria, who had spent the descent in uncharacteristic silence, suddenly turned to Richard. "I need to apologize to her. If I just explained that it wasn't about race, that I was having a bad day, that I didn't know who she was." "Absolutely not." Richard cut her off, his voice low but firm. "You've done enough damage. The only thing you're going to do is stay silent and follow the plan. Our entire future depends on not making this any worse than it already is." Logan, who had been silently observing his parents, suddenly spoke up. "You still don't get it, do you, Mom? It doesn't matter who she was. You poured wine on a kid because you didn't think she belonged in first class. That's who you are, and that's what everyone sees now." Victoria flinched as if struck. Her son's assessment, clear-eyed and unsparing, cut through her remaining defenses. For perhaps the first time, she glimpsed herself through others' eyes, and the image was devastating. As the main cabin passengers began to file past them toward the exit, many cast uncomfortable or openly disapproving glances at Victoria. The incident had spread throughout the plane during the flight, with videos being shared from first class to economy. By the time they landed, virtually everyone on board knew what had happened. The physical space of the aircraft, normally a transient environment where interactions remained fleeting and inconsequential, had been transformed into a stage where Victoria's character had been publicly exposed. The narrow aisle past her seat felt like a gauntlet as passengers' eyes registered recognition, judgment, and in some cases, barely concealed disgust. When they finally deplaned, nearly 20 minutes after the Morgans, the Prestons emerged into a changed reality. The terminal, normally a transitional space of anonymous movement, had transformed into another stage where they were now unwilling performers. Several passengers from their flight had lingered specifically to witness their emergence, some not so discreetly filming with their phones. A small group of airline staff escorted them through the terminal, less as a courtesy and more as a buffer against the attention they were receiving. Richard walked stiffly, his face set in a grim mask of contained fury. Victoria kept her eyes downcast, her designer handbag clutched before her like a shield. Logan trailed several steps behind, physically manifesting his desire to dissociate from his parents. As they approached the terminal exit, Richard received another text from the Preston Holdings crisis team. "Car waiting at special services exit. Avoid main terminal. Press already gathering at arrivals." The digital firestorm had manifested in physical form, with reporters from local stations and even a few national networks positioned at the main airport exits, hoping to capture footage of both the Morgans and the Prestons. The story had transcended social media to become breaking news, the viral videos providing irresistible visual content for television coverage. The Prestons were ushered through a side exit normally reserved for VIPs or passengers requiring special assistance, emerging into the California sunshine where a black SUV with tinted windows awaited them. As they settled into the vehicle, Victoria finally spoke. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain, so different from her usual confident assertions. Richard didn't immediately answer. His attention focused on a new message from the board chairman. Emergency meeting moved up to 3:30 p.m. Pacific. Your presence required. Video link being set up at hotel. Finally, he looked at his wife, his expression a complex mixture of anger, fear, and something like grief. Now we see if anything can be salvaged. The company, our reputation, our son's future, all of it hanging by a thread because you couldn't control your prejudice for a 3-hour flight. As their vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into San Francisco traffic, the physical separation between the Morgan and Preston families was complete. But the connection forged by those fateful moments at 35,000 feet would bind their stories together in ways none of them could yet fully comprehend. Across the terminal, Olivia and Zoe Morgan were experiencing a very different reception. The airline had provided them with access to their premium lounge, offering privacy from the gathering media presence. Within this protected space, Olivia was calmly handling the situation with her characteristic strategic thinking. "We'll proceed to the hotel as planned," she told her executive team on a video call. "I'll make my final decision about tomorrow's signing by 6:00 p.m., after I've had time to consult with our legal team and the board." As she spoke, Zoe sat nearby, examining her damaged book with a thoughtfulness beyond her years. The wine had dried, leaving the pages wrinkled and stained, the precious signature a blurred memory. Yet there was something almost poetic about the transformation. The story of these groundbreaking Black women mathematicians now carrying a physical testament to the persistence of prejudice they had fought against. Noticing her daughter's contemplation, Olivia paused her business call. "You okay, sweetheart?" Zoe looked up, her expression serious but composed. "I'm thinking about Katherine Johnson and what she would say about today." Olivia smiled, her pride in her daughter momentarily overshadowing the business crisis. "What do you think she would say?" "I think," Zoe replied carefully, "she would say that calculations are important, but some equations are about more than numbers. Sometimes they're about values." In that moment, as mother and daughter connected over a wine-stained book in an airport lounge while the digital world exploded with their story, the path forward became crystallized in Olivia's mind. The decision about Preston Holdings suddenly seemed simple, clarified by her daughter's wisdom and her own unwavering commitment to her principles. By 3:45 p.m. Pacific time, 4 hours after the incident, the physical separation of the Morgan and Preston families was complete. But the repercussions of their brief, fateful interaction were just beginning to unfold in ways that would permanently alter both families' trajectories and spark conversations far beyond the first-class cabin of Flight 385 on. Crisis management begins at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time, 2:00 p.m. Pacific, 18 hours until the scheduled contract signing. The crisis management machinery of both companies was operating at full capacity. Though with dramatically different objectives and tones, Preston Holdings' crisis team had commandeered a conference room at the San Francisco Four Seasons, transforming it into an emergency command center. Screens displayed real-time social media analytics, financial data, and news coverage. 6 senior executives had flown in from the company's Chicago headquarters, arriving just ahead of the Prestons. The company's top-tier PR firm had dispatched their crisis specialists. Legal counsel was reviewing contract termination clauses, and the board was preparing to convene virtually within the hour. The atmosphere was one of controlled panic, the corporate equivalent of a hospital trauma center, with the patient being Preston Holdings' very existence. "The stock is in free fall in after-hours trading," reported Chief Financial Officer David Harrington, his tie loosened and forehead shining with stress sweat, down 17.8% and still dropping. "If this continues into tomorrow's open, we're looking at the worst single-day loss in company history." Richard Preston sat at the head of the table, his face ashen. The magnitude of the crisis had finally fully registered. This wasn't just about a failed acquisition or a public embarrassment. This was potentially an extinction-level event for a century-old company. "What are our options if Phoenix walks?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The CFO and general counsel exchanged grim glances. "Frankly, sir, they're limited," the general counsel replied. "Without Phoenix's technology, we'd need to find another tech partner immediately, but most will be reluctant given the current situation. We could attempt to develop our own AI systems, but that would take years and hundreds of millions in investment capital that, frankly, we don't have. What about our existing clients, Aerospace Dynamics, Miller Manufacturing? We've received concerning communications from both," the head of client relations interjected. "They're monitoring the situation closely, with specific concerns about how this incident reflects on our corporate culture. ADI has specifically mentioned their diversity commitments and questioned alignment of values." In concrete terms, the CFO added, "if we lose the Phoenix acquisition and ADI doesn't renew their contracts, we're looking at potential layoffs of 30–40% of our workforce within 6 months. The liquidity projections are," he paused, selecting his words carefully, "challenging." Victoria Preston sat silently at the far end of the table, physically and symbolically distant from the decision-making process. For the first time in decades, no one was deferring to her opinion or seeking her approval. She had been positioned as the problem, not part of the solution. The crisis team had explicitly requested she not participate in media outreach or public statements, effectively quarantining her from the company's response. Outside in the hotel corridor, Logan Preston sat alone on a bench, scrolling through his phone. He had refused to join the crisis meeting, telling his father simply, "I have nothing to contribute to fixing what Mom broke." And instead, he was watching the story continue to unfold online, reading comments from people his age who were dissecting his family's behavior with merciless clarity. One TikTok particularly caught his attention, a split-screen analysis of the viral footage, alongside clips of Zoe Morgan's TED Talk about ethical leadership in technology. The creator, a popular commentator on business ethics, was highlighting the contrast between Olivia's stated values and how she embodied them during the crisis versus the Preston's public image and their actual behavior. The video had over 7 million views and was being shared widely with comments like, "This is the difference between performance and principle," and "Watch how real power responds to provocation." Logan found himself nodding in agreement, despite the fact that it was his own family being criticized. For years, he had observed the disconnect between his parents' carefully curated public image and their private behavior. Now that disconnect was visible to the world. Meanwhile, across San Francisco at the Fairmont Hotel, Phoenix Innovation's response was unfolding with characteristic strategic precision. Rather than a chaotic crisis center, Olivia had established a measured approach that reflected her leadership philosophy: deliberate, values-based, and forward-looking. She had arranged for Zoe to rest in their suite with room service and a hotel staff member specifically assigned to ensure her comfort and privacy. With her daughter's well-being addressed, Olivia was now conducting a series of focused virtual meetings from a hotel conference room, methodically working through the various dimensions of the situation. "Our first priority is clarity on our position," she told her executive team via secure video conference. "This isn't about punishing Preston Holdings or generating publicity. It's about ensuring alignment between our business decisions and our values." Her team had prepared a comprehensive analysis of the implications of canceling the acquisition, including financial impact, minimal long-term effect on Phoenix, potentially catastrophic for Preston, alternative acquisition targets 3 companies identified with similar manufacturing capabilities, legal considerations, cancellation penalties versus moral clause provisions, PR dimensions, media and market reaction to both possible decisions. If we proceed with an acquisition, we would need significant changes to the terms. Phoenix's general counsel explained, complete leadership restructuring at Preston, mandatory company-wide diversity training, integration of our ethical AI guidelines across their operations, and public commitments to specific diversity and inclusion metrics. Olivia considered this thoughtfully. And if we walk away entirely, we delay our hardware production timeline by approximately 12–18 months while we secure an alternative manufacturing partner. Stock might see short-term volatility, but would likely stabilize quickly given our strong fundamentals. The market generally rewards values-based leadership, especially when it's consistent with our established brand. Throughout this discussion, Olivia's approach remained measured and strategic. There were no emotional outbursts, no reactive decisions, no vindictive language. Instead, there was thoughtful consideration of all stakeholders: Phoenix employees, Preston Holdings workers who had nothing to do with the Preston's behavior, investors, clients, and the broader communities both companies served. Prepare both announcements, Olivia finally decided. I'll make my final decision after speaking with Zoe. This impacts her directly, and while she's young, her perspective matters in this. This inclusion of her daughter in the decision-making process wasn't performative. It reflected Olivia's genuine belief that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, and that those directly affected by decisions deserved a voice in making them. As these parallel crisis management processes unfolded across San Francisco, the digital story continued evolving. News organizations had moved beyond simply reporting the incident to analyzing its broader implications. Business publications were discussing corporate culture and leadership ethics. Tech outlets were examining how Olivia Morgan's response reflected her company's values. Social commentators were using the incident to highlight persistent patterns of discrimination in elite spaces. What had begun as a moment of casual cruelty was transforming into a case study in consequences: personal, professional, and societal. As 5 p.m. Eastern Time approached, with 18 hours remaining until the scheduled contract signing, both companies were preparing for decisions that would resonate far beyond their bottom lines. The Preston crisis team was desperately searching for a path to corporate survival. The Phoenix team was thoughtfully aligning business decisions with core values. And across social media, millions of people were watching, commenting, and learning from a masterclass in the true meaning of power, not the ability to harm others without immediate consequences, but the wisdom to respond to harm with dignity, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to one's principles. Part 4, the consequences. At 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific, the day's public drama had given way to private reckonings as both families processed the events in dramatically different environments. In the Morgan suite at the Fairmont Hotel, Olivia had created a space of calm reflection amid the storm. Room service had delivered a comfort food dinner of gourmet macaroni and cheese, fresh fruit, and warm chocolate chip cookies, Zoe's favorites. Mother and daughter sat together on the suite's plush sofa, the San Francisco skyline glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows as evening settled over the bay. Zoe had changed from her wine-stained clothes into soft pajamas, her hair wrapped in a colorful satin bonnet for the night. The damaged book lay on the coffee table before them, its pages now dry but permanently altered, the stains creating a marbled pattern across the text. "I've been thinking," Olivia said, gently stroking her daughter's hair, "about what happened today and what we should do about it." Zoe looked up, her young face thoughtful. "About the Preston company?" Olivia nodded, impressed as always by her daughter's perceptiveness. "Yes, I have a big decision to make by morning, and I want to know how you feel about it." This wasn't performative inclusion. It was genuine respect for her daughter's perspective. Olivia had always believed that children deserved to be taken seriously, especially regarding events that directly affected them. If we go forward with buying their company, it would be like saying what that woman did doesn't matter, Zoe observed. But if we don't, a lot of people who work there might lose their jobs, and they didn't do anything wrong. Olivia smiled at her daughter's nuanced understanding. That's exactly right. It's a complex decision with real consequences for many people. What would happen to them, the Prestons? Richard would likely lose his position as CEO. Victoria would face significant social consequences. Their son, Logan, Zoe supplied, surprising Olivia. "You know his name?" Zoe nodded. "I heard his mom call him that, and he looked really embarrassed by what she did. He seems different from them." Olivia considered this thoughtfully. Her daughter's observation aligned with her own impression of the Preston son, a young man visibly uncomfortable with his parents' behavior. It added another dimension to consider. "Mom," Zoe continued, her voice growing more serious, "remember when you told me about that investor who said really sexist things to you, and you walked away from his money even though you really needed it for the company?" Olivia nodded. It had been early in Phoenix's history, when financing was scarce and a major venture capital firm had offered funding with the male partner making inappropriate comments and suggestions. You said that some money costs too much even when you need it, Zoe recalled. Is this the same? The wisdom in her daughter's question struck Olivia deeply. From the mouths of babes, indeed. She pulled Zoe closer, overwhelmed with pride at the young woman she was raising. Yes, sweetheart, I think it might be. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Then Zoe reached for her damaged book, carefully turning the wine-stained pages. I was reading about Katherine Johnson again, she said. Even when they were cruel to her, she kept doing her calculations. She didn't let their behavior stop her from reaching for the stars. Olivia waited, sensing her daughter had more to say. But she also didn't pretend it was okay. Zoe continued. She used the white bathroom anyway. She demanded respect by being too good to ignore. In that moment, something crystallized for Olivia. The path forward illuminated not by financial projections or market analyses, but by the wisdom of her 12-year-old daughter connecting their present circumstances to the legacy of a pioneering Black mathematician who had changed history through excellence that refused to be diminished. I think I know what we need to do, Olivia said, kissing the top of Zoe's head. And I think Katherine Johnson would approve. Across the city at the Four Seasons, the Preston family was experiencing a very different evening aftermath. Their presidential suite, normally a space of luxury and privilege, had transformed into something resembling a war room combined with a family therapy session gone horribly wrong. Richard paced the living area, his tie discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up, constantly checking his phone for updates from the crisis team working 2 floors below. The emergency board meeting had concluded an hour earlier with a grim ultimatum: salvage the Phoenix deal by morning or face a vote of no confidence. Victoria sat rigidly on the edge of a sofa, her perfect posture now seeming less like elegance and more like brittleness. The carefully constructed identity she had maintained for decades, the sophisticated corporate wife, the charitable socialite, the arbiter of social standing, had shattered in the space of a few hours, leaving her disoriented in unfamiliar emotional territory. The board is discussing succession plans, Richard announced, his voice flat with exhaustion. If the deal falls through, they're prepared to announce my retirement by noon tomorrow. Victoria looked up sharply. They can't do that. The company has your name on it. Your family built it. They can and they will, Richard replied, a bitter edge to his voice. The stock is in free fall. Major clients are threatening to pull contracts. The reputation damages. He trailed off, unable to fully articulate the magnitude of the crisis. It was 1 glass of wine, Victoria said, her voice small but still holding traces of indignation. 1 moment. How can everything fall apart over 1 moment? From the doorway of his connected bedroom, Logan's voice cut through the tension. It wasn't 1 moment, Mom. It was just the first time everyone could see who you really are. He stood there in jeans and a hoodie, his tall frame seeming older than his 16 years, his expression a mixture of anger and something like grief. He had been avoiding his parents since they'd arrived at the hotel, retreating to his room and communicating only when absolutely necessary. Richard sighed heavily. Logan, not now. We're trying to what? Dad, pretend this is some PR problem? Some temporary social media embarrassment? Logan's voice rose with emotion he rarely displayed. Mom poured wine on a kid because she was Black. Everyone saw it. Everyone knows exactly what it was. Victoria flinched as if struck. That is not true. It had nothing to do with that. She just didn't seem like she belonged in first class. And why didn't she seem like she belonged? Logan pressed, stepping fully into the room now. What was it about her that made you decide she didn't belong in a space you thought was only for people like us? The direct challenge left Victoria momentarily speechless, confronted with a question that required her to examine prejudices so deeply ingrained she had never acknowledged them, even to herself. You've spent my entire life making comments about those people, Logan continued, his voice tight with long-suppressed frustration. At restaurants, at Dad's company events, about my friends at school, but you always did it where only we could hear. Today, you just got caught doing it where everyone could see. Richard attempted to redirect the conversation to practical matters. Logan, we understand you're upset, but right now we need to focus on the company's survival. People's jobs are at stake. Yeah, and whose fault is that? Logan's frustration boiled over. You've both spent my entire life teaching me that actions have consequences, but somehow that never applied to you. Well, guess what? Now it does. With that, he turned and walked back into his room, closing the door firmly behind him. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent suite, leaving Richard and Victoria alone with the wreckage of the life they had built. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. What are we going to do? She whispered, real fear in her voice for perhaps the first time in their marriage. Richard, what are we going to do? Richard sank into a chair across from her, the weight of the crisis physically manifesting in his slumped shoulders and haggard expression. I don't know, he admitted. For the first time in my life, I truly don't know. His phone buzzed with another message from the crisis team. Morgan team not responding to settlement offers. Preparing for worst-case scenario announcement tomorrow. As night settled over San Francisco, the contrast between the two hotel suites could not have been more stark. In one, a mother and daughter found clarity and purpose through shared values and mutual respect. In the other, a family fracture that had been developing for years was finally breaking open under the pressure of public accountability. And in both suites, decisions were crystallizing that would forever alter the trajectories of the Morgan and Preston families. The corporate decision at 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:15 p.m. Pacific. Olivia Morgan convened a final strategy session with her executive team. The Fairmont Hotel had provided a secure conference room with state-of-the-art communication technology, allowing key Phoenix leaders from across the country to join virtually for this pivotal discussion. Olivia sat at the head of the conference table, the San Francisco skyline glittering behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a simple but elegant navy blazer over a white blouse, professional but not ostentatious, reflecting her leadership philosophy that substance mattered more than appearance. Before her lay comprehensive briefing documents, legal analyses, and market projections prepared by her team throughout the day. Thank you all for your extraordinary work today, she began, acknowledging the crisis response that had unfolded across multiple time zones. Before we finalize our decision regarding Preston Holdings, I want to ensure we've considered this from every angle, not just financial and strategic, but ethical and cultural as well. Phoenix's Chief Financial Officer, James Chen, spoke first from his New York location. From a purely financial perspective, we have multiple options. The Preston acquisition would accelerate our hardware development timeline by approximately 18 months, but we've identified 3 alternative manufacturing partners that could fulfill similar capabilities with a 12 to 24-month adjustment to our timeline. He displayed a comparative analysis showing the projected revenue impacts of each scenario. Bottom line, while Preston offers the fastest route to market for our new diagnostic hardware, their current situation creates significant reputational risks that could offset any time-to-market advantages. General Counsel Maria Rodriguez followed with the legal assessment. We have clear grounds to terminate the acquisition under the moral clause provisions of our agreement. Section 7.3 specifically allows withdrawal if actions by Preston leadership create substantial reputational risk or demonstrate values misalignment with Phoenix's core principles. She paused, adjusting her glasses as she referenced specific language. Importantly, exercising this clause would shield us from the standard termination penalties. Our position is legally sound should Preston attempt to challenge the withdrawal. Chief Communications Officer David Washington provided the public relations perspective. The incident has generated unprecedented engagement across platforms. Analysis of sentiment shows overwhelming support for Zoe and yourself, with corresponding negative sentiment toward the Prestons. He displayed heat maps showing conversation intensity across social platforms. If we proceed with the acquisition, we would need an extremely robust communications strategy explaining the decision. Even then, we'd likely face significant pushback from supporters who expect us to take a stand. If we terminate the acquisition, the announcement would align with public expectation and reinforce Phoenix's brand values of integrity and respect. Chief People Officer Lisa Patel added the cultural dimension. We've conducted pulse surveys with employee resource groups throughout the day. Our Black employee network in particular has expressed strong concern about partnering with a company whose leadership demonstrated such explicit bias. They've questioned how we could maintain our inclusive culture while integrating a workforce led by individuals with demonstrated prejudice. As each executive presented their analysis, Olivia listened attentively, asking clarifying questions and ensuring every perspective was thoroughly explored. This collaborative approach was signature to her leadership style, gathering comprehensive input before making decisions that affected the entire organization. When the presentations concluded, Olivia leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful but resolved. Thank you all for this thorough analysis. Before I share my decision, I want to address something fundamental to who we are as a company. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I founded Phoenix 11 years ago, I committed to building a company where excellence and ethics were equally valued, where we would measure success not just by what we achieved, but by how we achieved it. That commitment has guided every major decision we've made, from declining certain government contracts to our stance on data privacy to our hiring practices. The executives nodded, many having been with the company long enough to have witnessed these principled choices firsthand. Today's decision is particularly significant because it involves more than business strategy. It involves basic human dignity, represented most powerfully by how my daughter was treated simply for existing in a space someone felt she didn't belong in. Olivia's voice remained steady, but those who knew her well could detect the controlled emotion beneath her professional demeanor. I've considered what proceeding with this acquisition would signal, both externally to the world and internally to our team members who have trusted us to create a workplace where they are valued for their contributions, not judged by their appearance. I've weighed the potential benefits of faster market entry against the cost to our organizational integrity and cultural cohesion. She straightened slightly. Her decision crystallized. We will not be proceeding with the acquisition of Preston Holdings. The announcement, though expected by many on the call, still carried significant weight. Several executives nodded in agreement, while others made notes about next steps. Maria, please prepare the formal termination notice, citing the moral clause provisions. David, develop a communication strategy that focuses on our values-based decision-making without unnecessarily vilifying Preston Holdings or its employees, who bear no responsibility for their leadership's actions. James, please refine the alternative manufacturing partner analysis so we can proceed quickly with Plan B. As Olivia issued clear directives to each team member, the Phoenix response machine shifted seamlessly from retry, continue. As Olivia issued clear directives to each team member, the Phoenix response machine shifted seamlessly from decision-making to implementation, a testament to the organizational culture she had built over years of thoughtful leadership. One additional point, Olivia added as the meeting prepared to conclude. I want us to consider how we might support the Preston Holdings employees who may be affected by this decision. They aren't responsible for Victoria Preston's actions or the company's leadership failures. Let's explore whether we can offer priority consideration for appropriate roles at Phoenix or connections to our industry partners. This final instruction, looking beyond the immediate business decision to consider its human impact, exemplified why Olivia Morgan had become one of the most respected leaders in tech, even in the midst of a crisis not of her making. She maintained the perspective and compassion that had defined her leadership from the beginning. As the meeting adjourned, Phoenix's chief marketing officer lingered on the video call. Olivia, may I ask a personal question? Of course, Rebecca. How is Zoe doing through all of this? It must be overwhelming for a 12-year-old to be at the center of such a public incident. Olivia's expression softened at the mention of her daughter. She's handling it with remarkable grace. In fact, her perspective helped clarify this decision for me. When I was weighing all the complex factors, she reminded me of a much simpler truth, that some compromises cost too much, even when they offer apparent advantages. Rebecca smiled. Sounds like she's very much her mother's daughter. In the best ways, I hope, Olivia replied, and hopefully a little wiser about navigating certain aspects of the world than I was at her age. As the conference room emptied and Olivia gathered her materials, she felt the weight of the decision, but also a profound clarity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, explaining the decision to shareholders, navigating the media response, reconstructing their hardware development timeline. But tonight, she had honored what mattered most, the values that had built Phoenix Innovations and the dignity her daughter deserved simply by virtue of being human. At 11:15 p.m., with the billion-dollar decision finalized, Olivia Morgan returned to her suite where Zoe was waiting to hear what they had decided together. The public announcement at 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time, 6 o'clock a.m. Pacific the next day, the news broke simultaneously across multiple channels, sending ripples through business communities worldwide. Phoenix Innovations released a carefully crafted statement through official channels. Phoenix Innovations announces the termination of acquisition discussions with Preston Holdings, effective immediately. This decision reflects Phoenix's commitment to maintaining alignment between our business practices and our core values of dignity, respect, and inclusion. While we recognize the potential strategic benefits of this acquisition, we believe that leadership character and corporate culture are fundamental components of successful business relationships. Recent events have made it clear that our values are not sufficiently aligned to proceed with this partnership. Phoenix Innovations remains committed to expanding our hardware manufacturing capabilities through alternative partnerships that will be announced in the coming weeks. This decision is not expected to materially impact our long-term growth strategy or product development timelines. Dr. Olivia Morgan, founder and CEO of Phoenix Innovations, stated, "At Phoenix, we believe that how we conduct business is as important as what we achieve. We cannot compartmentalize our values when making business decisions. While we wish the employees of Preston Holdings well, we must proceed in a direction that honors our commitments to our team members, our customers, and our communities." The statement was notable for what it didn't contain. No direct reference to the airplane incident, no personal attacks against Victoria Preston, and no self-congratulatory positioning. It was matter-of-fact and principle-focused, reflecting Olivia's leadership style. Simultaneously, major financial news outlets received the announcement and immediately began broadcasting breaking news alerts. Breaking: Phoenix Innovations terminates $1 to B Preston Holdings acquisition. Phoenix walks away from Preston deal following viral incident. Tech giant cancels billion-dollar acquisition, citing values misalignment. CNBC cut into regular programming with an urgent update. We have breaking news in the business world. Phoenix Innovations has officially terminated its planned $1.2 billion acquisition of Preston Holdings. This comes less than 24 hours after a viral incident aboard a commercial flight where Victoria Preston, wife of Preston Holdings CEO Richard Preston, was filmed pouring wine on the 12-year-old daughter of Phoenix CEO Dr. Olivia Morgan, in what many have characterized as a racially motivated act. Phoenix cited values misalignment in their official statement. "We're going now to our technology correspondent in San Francisco." The reporter stood outside Phoenix's San Francisco offices, where increased security was visible at the entrances. "Jim, I'm here at Phoenix Innovations West Coast headquarters, where the mood is described as focused and resolved. Sources inside the company tell me that Dr. Morgan personally announced the decision to her executive team late last night after careful deliberation. What's remarkable here is how Phoenix is handling this. No grandstanding, no public attacks on the Prestons, just a clear, values-based business decision." On Wall Street, the market reaction was swift and devastating for Preston Holdings. When trading opened, PRH shares plummeted immediately, triggering circuit breakers designed to pause trading during extreme volatility. When trading resumed, the downward spiral continued, with the stock ultimately closing down 42.7% for the day, effectively erasing nearly half the company's market value in a single trading session. Phoenix Innovations PHX experienced different market dynamics. After an initial dip of about 3% at the opening bell, reflecting market uncertainty about the collapsed deal, the stock steadily recovered throughout the day. By closing, PHX had actually gained 2.3%, as investors responded positively to the company's values-driven leadership and the clarity of their alternative growth strategy. Financial analysts across networks offered varied perspectives. This is a textbook example of how personal conduct can have material business impact in today's connected world, noted veteran market analyst Fernando Rodriguez on Bloomberg TV. Preston Holdings wasn't just losing an acquisition, they were losing a technological lifeline they desperately needed to remain competitive. The market is responding not just to the failed deal, but to the leadership failure it represents. On Fox Business, commentator Sarah Johnson provided a different perspective. While the market is punishing Preston Holdings severely today, we should note that Phoenix is also taking a calculated risk. By walking away from this acquisition, They're delaying their hardware development by potentially 18-24 months. That's significant in the fast-moving tech sector, and competitors could capitalize on this window. But that's exactly why this decision is so powerful, countered her co-panelist, tech industry consultant Marcus Bell. Morgan is saying that some things matter more than market timing. And ironically, the market seems to agree with her. This sends a message that corporate culture and leadership integrity aren't just nice-to-haves. They're material business factors that directly impact shareholder value. Preston Holdings released their own statement approximately 2 hours after Phoenix's announcement, though insiders reported that it had undergone multiple revisions as the company struggled to find the right tone. Preston Holdings acknowledges the termination of acquisition discussions with Phoenix Innovations. While we are disappointed with this outcome, we respect their decision and are focusing on alternative strategic directions for our company. Regarding the unfortunate incident involving Mrs. Preston, the company wishes to clarify that her actions do not reflect Preston Holdings' corporate values or policies. We deeply regret any distress caused to Dr. Morgan and her daughter. The board of directors is convening to discuss leadership transition plans, which will be announced in the near future. Preston Holdings remains committed to serving our clients, supporting our employees, and creating value for our shareholders during this challenging time. The statement's reference to leadership transition plans was immediately seized upon by business media as confirmation of rumors that Richard Preston would be stepping down as CEO, effectively ending 3 generations of family leadership at the company. Social media reaction to the announcements reflected the digital divide that had been apparent from the beginning. Tech leaders and industry influencers overwhelmingly supported Phoenix's decision. Venture capitalist Ariana Mendez posted, "This is why Olivia Morgan is a leader. People actually follow rather than just obey. Values-based decisions might cost in the short term, but build unshakable foundations for the long term." Hashtag Phoenix Rising. Tech entrepreneur Marcus Wilson, who had been on the flight, shared, "Witnessed this situation unfold in real time. Dr. Morgan's response was a masterclass in leadership, and today's decision is consistent with everything Phoenix Innovation stands for. Some things matter more than money. Hashtag integrity over income." Conservative business commentators offered more mixed reactions. Financial host William Barrett tweeted, "Phoenix walking away from Preston acquisition will cost shareholders real money and delay product launches. Is this about values or virtue signaling? Markets ultimately reward results, not political statements. Hashtag business decisions." Investment advisor Robert Thompson countered, "Actually, the market is rewarding Phoenix today. Their stock is up. This isn't about politics, it's about leadership character and company culture, which directly impact long-term performance. Smart investors understand this." The human story behind the business headlines continued to resonate across platforms, with hashtag Zoe Morgan trending as people shared their own experiences of discrimination in elite spaces and praised the young girl's composure under pressure. Several children's book publishers had already reached out to Phoenix's communications team with offers to replace Zoe's damaged book, and the Katherine Johnson Foundation announced they would be sending her a special edition with a new personalized message. At the Fairmont Hotel, Olivia Morgan addressed her team in San Francisco with characteristic straightforwardness. "We've made our decision based on our values. Now we move forward. I need our manufacturing team to accelerate discussions with Takahashi Precision and Rivera Technologies as potential alternative partners. Let's turn this moment into momentum." Meanwhile, across town at the Four Seasons, the Preston Holdings crisis had evolved into a full corporate implosion. The board had convened an emergency in-person meeting in the hotel's secure conference facility, with heightened security to keep media at bay. Inside, Richard Preston faced the culmination of what many described as a long-brewing leadership crisis merely catalyzed by yesterday's incident. By 9 a.m. Pacific time, 3 hours after the announcements, Preston Holdings issued a follow-up statement that confirmed what many had already anticipated. The board of directors of Preston Holdings announces the resignation of Richard Preston as chief executive officer, effective immediately. Martin Reynolds, current chief operating officer, will serve as interim CEO while the board conducts a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. The board thanks Mr. Preston for his years of service and his family's multi-generational contributions to building Preston Holdings. This transition represents an opportunity to reimagine our company's direction and culture for a changing business landscape. Additionally, Preston Holdings is launching a comprehensive review of our corporate culture, diversity practices, and leadership development programs to ensure alignment with contemporary business standards and stakeholder expectations. The statement was notable for its complete absence of any mention of Victoria Preston or reference to the incident that had precipitated the leadership change, an omission that was itself telling about the company's approach to accountability. For many observers, the contrast between the two companies' handling of the crisis was as instructive as the incident itself. Phoenix Innovations had addressed the situation directly, made a clear values-based decision, communicated it transparently, and immediately pivoted to forward-looking action. Preston Holdings had attempted damage control, obscured accountability, made personnel changes without acknowledging their root cause, and focused on preserving what remained of the company's reputation rather than addressing the fundamental issues exposed by the incident. By midday, business schools were already developing case studies on the corporate governance implications, communications strategies, and leadership lessons emerging from what was being called the first-class incident. Harvard Business Review had commissioned an urgent analysis titled, "When Personal Conduct Meets Corporate Governance, the Phoenix Preston Case Study." As press conferences were scheduled, analysts updated projections, and social media continued to dissect every aspect of the story. The business world had received a powerful reminder about the interconnectedness of personal conduct, corporate values, and financial outcomes in the digital age. The billion-dollar decision had been announced, and its repercussions were only beginning to unfold. The broader impact. By 48 hours after the incident, what had begun as a personal confrontation on an airplane had expanded into a multifaceted societal conversation touching on corporate ethics, racial bias, parenting, accountability in the digital age, and the evolving definition of leadership. In corporate boardrooms across America, the first-class incident had become shorthand for discussions about the tangible business impact of personal conduct in company culture, and diversity and inclusion officers reported being invited to meetings that had previously been closed to them, as executive teams suddenly recognized the material risks of failing to address bias within their organizations. We've received more inquiries about our corporate culture assessment services in the past 48 hours than in the previous 6 months, noted Dr. Alicia Ramirez, founder of a leading diversity consultancy. Companies are suddenly asking themselves, do we have a Victoria Preston in our leadership? And what would it cost us if they were exposed? The financial implications continued to unfold dramatically for Preston Holdings. By the second day of trading after the announcement, the company's stock had lost a total of 67% of its value. Major clients were publicly distancing themselves from the company, with Aerospace Dynamics International announcing they would be reviewing all contracts upon renewal, and Miller Manufacturing exploring alternative suppliers aligned with our corporate values. Credit rating agencies had downgraded Preston Holdings' debt to junk status, making borrowing prohibitively expensive at precisely the moment the company most needed capital to reinvent itself. Financial analysts were openly discussing whether the company could survive as an independent entity or would need to be sold off in pieces. Martin Reynolds, the interim CEO, had announced a comprehensive restructuring that would include significant workforce reductions, the first mass layoffs in the company's century-long history. The human cost of Victoria Preston's moment of cruelty was being calculated in thousands of jobs, retirement savings, and healthcare benefits now at risk. For Phoenix Innovations, the picture was markedly different. After the initial volatility, their stock had stabilized and begun a steady upward trajectory as investors responded positively to Olivia Morgan's leadership. The company had announced accelerated discussions with Takahashi Precision, a Japanese manufacturing firm with values more closely aligned with Phoenix's own, suggesting the hardware development timeline might not be as delayed as initially feared. Perhaps most significantly, Phoenix had received an unprecedented influx of job applications, over 17,000 in just 48 hours, with many applicants specifically citing the company's values-based decision-making as their motivation for wanting to join the organization. As one viral tweet from a senior engineer at a competing firm put it, "Just submitted my resume to Phoenix. I want to work for a company where doing the right thing isn't negotiable." #Phoenix Rising. Beyond the business implications, the incident had sparked broader conversations about privilege, accountability, and dignity in public spaces. Major news programs devoted segments to exploring the persistent reality of racial bias in supposedly elite environments. CNN featured a panel discussion titled, "When Belonging is Questioned: Race and Space in America," featuring sociologists, civil rights attorneys, and individuals sharing similar experiences of having their presence challenged in first-class cabins, exclusive restaurants, or high-end stores. The Atlantic published a feature article, "The Air We Breathe: How Casual Bigotry Shapes American Spaces," examining how incidents like Victoria Preston's reflected deeper patterns of spatial control and belonging in American society. Educational institutions had quickly incorporated the incident into teaching materials. A Harvard Business School professor adjusted her ethics curriculum to include the case study, framing it as a real-time example of how leadership character directly impacts business outcomes. Middle school teachers reported using age-appropriate versions of the story to discuss bullying, dignity, and standing up for oneself, with Zoe Morgan emerging as a role model for children facing similar situations. The contrast between Olivia and Victoria had become a cultural touchpoint for discussions about different models of womanhood, power, and success. Opinion pieces analyzed how their responses reflected divergent understandings of status, one based on achievement and character, the other on exclusion and hierarchy. Perhaps most significantly, the story had resonated deeply with people who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the platform or power to respond as effectively as Olivia Morgan had. Thousands shared their own stories across social media with hashtags like #MyFirstClassMoment and #WhenTheyDidn'tThinkI belonged, creating a powerful catalog of everyday discrimination that often went unchallenged. One particularly viral thread came from Dr. Sarah Johnson, a Black cardiologist who described being mistaken for janitorial staff while wearing her white coat in her own hospital. "Victoria Preston isn't an anomaly," she wrote. "She's just one who got caught on camera saying the quiet part out loud. This happens every day, usually without wine as evidence." Technology platforms were responding to the moment as well. LinkedIn had featured a special article collection about values-based leadership, with Olivia Morgan's approach highlighted as exemplary. TikTok had created a curated educational page about dignity and respect in public spaces, featuring expert voices discussing the psychological impact of belonging uncertainty on marginalized communities. For the Preston family, the broader impact was profoundly personal. Richard Preston had not only lost his position, but was now essentially unemployable in executive roles, with multiple corporate board memberships also rescinded. The family name, once synonymous with industrial innovation and success, had become a cautionary tale about the costs of entrenched prejudice. Victoria Preston had effectively disappeared from public view, canceling all social engagements and charity board participation. Sources close to the family reported she was devastated by the unfolding consequences and had begun working with both a crisis management team and a therapist specializing in privilege awareness and personal transformation. Logan Preston, perhaps the most sympathetic figure in the family drama, had emerged as something of a minor social media hero for his visible discomfort with his mother's behavior and his subsequent reported confrontation with his parents at the hotel. Young people in particular responded to his apparent break from his family's values, with supportive comments flooding his previously obscure Instagram account. 2 days after the incident, the story continued evolving in ways that transcended the original confrontation, touching on fundamental questions about power, dignity, and accountability in American society. What Victoria Preston had likely viewed as a moment of asserting her social position had instead become a defining example of how privilege unexamined becomes poison to corporations, families, and ultimately to one's own humanity. As news outlets continued covering different dimensions of the story, from the business implications to the cultural significance, a clear narrative had emerged. Sometimes a single moment of cruelty can expose systems of inequality that normally remain invisible to those who benefit from them. And in the digital age, such moments can transform from personal confrontations to cultural reckonings with breathtaking speed. The broader impact of Flight 385 was still unfolding, but one thing had become clear. Wine stains eventually fade, but the consequences of how we treat one another can prove permanent. Part 5, Transformation and Resolution. 1 week after the flight, the Preston family was experiencing the most profound crisis of their lives, a multi-dimensional collapse of identity, status, financial security, and family cohesion that left them struggling to recognize their own lives. Richard Preston sat alone in his home office in Chicago, surrounded by the trappings of success that now felt hollow. The oak-paneled walls, the awards for business leadership, the framed photos with politicians and celebrities who were now avoiding his calls. Before him lay the final paperwork from the Preston Holdings Board, his formal separation agreement, the transfer of his remaining shares to the company's employee stock ownership plan, and the removal of the Preston name from all corporate branding moving forward. The company his grandfather had founded in 1928, that his father had expanded through the post-war boom, that he had guided into the digital age, would now continue without any Preston involvement for the first time in nearly a century. The family legacy had effectively ended with a glass of wine at 35,000 feet. His phone, once constantly buzzing with messages from business associates, board members, and social connections, had grown increasingly silent. The country club had discreetly suggested a temporary pause in his membership. Charity organizations where he had served as a major donor had found reasons to postpone events he was scheduled to attend. Former friends discovered they were suddenly overwhelmed with commitments when he reached out. Richard had experienced business setbacks before, economic downturns, failed product launches, tough quarters, but nothing had prepared him for this comprehensive rejection. It wasn't just a professional failure, it was a complete collapse of the social structure that had defined his identity for decades. In the family room downstairs, Victoria Preston was experiencing her own version of reckoning. The carefully cultivated image she had maintained for decades, the sophisticated corporate wife, the discerning social arbiter, the generous if somewhat condescending philanthropist, had shattered beyond repair. The social world that had once revolved around her approval now united in her rejection. Her phone contained dozens of unanswered texts from former friends, most expressing variations of thinking of you without actually offering support or defending her actions. The charity board she had dominated had requested her resignation. The social calendar that had structured her days was now ominously empty. Victoria sat staring at her tablet, scrolling through news coverage that continued analyzing her behavior from every angle. Psychological, sociological, cultural. She had become, almost overnight, a case study in entitlement, a symbol of unchecked privilege, a cautionary tale taught in diversity seminars. "I never thought of myself as a racist," she whispered to the empty room, speaking aloud the defense she had repeated to herself countless times over the past week. "I just thought some people didn't belong in certain places." The contradiction in that statement, the inability to connect her abstract self-perception with her concrete actions, reflected the work that lay ahead for her, if she chose to undertake it. So far, her responses had cycled through denial, anger, attempts to deflect blame, and finally, a creeping recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, the problem lay within herself. Victoria's crisis management team had arranged for her to meet with Dr. Elena Ramirez, a therapist specializing in privilege awareness and personal transformation. Their first session had been difficult, Victoria fluctuating between defensive justifications and moments of genuine shock as Dr. Ramirez gently helped her examine the assumptions underlying her behavior on the flight. "Mrs. Preston," Dr. Ramirez had asked, "when you saw Olivia and Zoe Morgan in the first-class cabin, what specific observations led you to conclude they didn't belong there?" Victoria had struggled to articulate concrete reasons, eventually admitting, "They just didn't look like first-class passengers to me." And what does a first-class passenger look like? The question had hung in the air, forcing Victoria to confront the unexamined biases that had shaped her worldview for decades. The realization that her criteria for belonging were fundamentally tied to race had been genuinely shocking to her, not because she didn't hold those beliefs, but because she had never been forced to name them explicitly, even to herself. Logan Preston's situation differed dramatically from his parents'. At 16, he was experiencing a complex mix of emotions: embarrassment over his family's public disgrace, relief at finally seeing his mother's behavior subjected to the criticism he had long felt it deserved, guilt over this relief, and uncertainty about his own future. Since returning to Chicago, he had largely isolated himself in his bedroom, attending his private school's classes remotely under the guise of family circumstances. The reality was that he couldn't face his classmates, particularly his friends of color, knowing what they had likely seen online. This afternoon, however, Logan had made a decision that represented his first real break from his family's expectations. Sitting at his desk, he was composing an email to Zoe Morgan, a step he was taking without his parents' knowledge or approval. "Dear Zoe," he typed, then paused, considering his words carefully. How does one apologize for witnessing a family member's cruelty without intervening? What words could possibly bridge the chasm between their experiences? He started again. "I've been thinking about what happened on the flight last week, and I wanted to reach out to say how truly sorry I am for what my mother did. I should have spoken up in the moment instead of just sitting there. There's no excuse for her behavior or for my silence." Logan continued writing, his words becoming more confident as he expressed thoughts he had been holding back for years. "The truth is, this isn't the first time I've seen my mother act this way. It's just the first time it was caught on camera and the first time there were real consequences. I've been uncomfortable with a lot of my parents' attitudes and behaviors for a long time, but I never knew how to challenge them." He paused again, wondering if he was sharing too much, then decided that honesty was more important than comfort. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking you or your mom to make me feel better about what happened. I just wanted you to know that not everyone in my family shares those views, and I'm trying to figure out how to be better than what I've been raised to be." After reading it through several times, Logan finally clicked send, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. It was a small step, perhaps, but it represented something significant. His first active choice to define himself separately from his family's values and behaviors. Downstairs, Richard and Victoria were having their own difficult conversation about the future. The financial implications of the past week had finally become clear. Richard's severance package would support them for a while, but their lifestyle would need to change dramatically. The family's net worth, once buoyed by Preston Holdings stock options, had diminished by over 70% in a week. "We should consider selling the house," Richard said, his voice flat with resignation. "Downsizing to something more manageable given our new circumstances." Victoria looked around at the 8,000 square foot home she had spent years perfecting. The custom furnishings, the art collection, the meticulously landscaped grounds. The thought of leaving it was physically painful, yet another loss in a week defined by losses. "Where would we go?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just physical location. Richard shook his head. "I don't know. Somewhere we can start over, I suppose. Somewhere people don't know us." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent decades cultivating their social position, ensuring everyone in their circles knew exactly who they were and what they represented. Now anonymity had become desirable, a shield against judgment rather than a condition to be overcome. "What about Logan?" Victoria asked. The first time in days she had shown concern for someone besides herself. "How do we protect him from all this?" Richard sighed heavily. "I'm not sure we can. Victoria, he's 16, online constantly, attending a school where everyone knows what happened. We can't shield him from the consequences of our actions, especially when he clearly believes those consequences are deserved." The acknowledgement stunned Victoria into silence. For the first time, she was forced to consider that her son might view her behavior not as an unfortunate misunderstanding or an overreaction by an overly sensitive society, but as a moral failure that revealed her true character. As evening settled over the Preston home, the family remained separated in their individual spaces, each grappling with their own dimension of the shared crisis. The structure of their lives, professional identity, social standing, financial security, family cohesion, had collapsed with stunning speed, leaving them to navigate unfamiliar emotional terrain without their usual resources and defenses. For the first time, they were facing consequences that couldn't be managed away with money, connections, or social privilege. The transformation forced upon them was only beginning, and whether it would lead to genuine growth or merely sophisticated resentment remained an open question. The Preston family fallout represented more than just a cautionary tale about public behavior in the digital age. It offered a glimpse into what happens when long unchallenged privilege suddenly faces accountability, when the invisible systems that have supported one's worldview become painfully visible through their absence. 1 week after Flight 385, the Preston family was discovering what many had always known: dignity isn't an exclusive commodity to be hoarded or bestowed, but a fundamental human need whose denial diminishes both the target and, ultimately, the perpetrator. Logan's journey. 2 weeks after the incident on Flight 385, Logan Preston sat nervously in a corner booth at Cafe Strata, a popular Berkeley coffee shop. He had chosen this location carefully, public enough to feel safe for both parties, casual enough to reduce pressure, and importantly, far from Chicago and the immediate sphere of his parents' influence. The trip itself had been a small act of rebellion. When Logan had received Zoe Morgan's cautious but open response to his email, suggesting they might meet if he happened to be in the Bay Area, he had made it happen without consulting his parents. Using funds from his trust fund, which he could access for educational purposes, he had booked a flight in a hotel room, telling his parents only that he was visiting a prospective college for the weekend. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had scheduled a tour of Berkeley for the following day, genuinely interested in the school's ethics program. But the primary purpose of his trip was sitting across from him now, Olivia and Zoe Morgan, regarding him with cautious but not unkind expressions. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Logan said, his voice steadier than he felt. At 16, he was tall and lanky with his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, though today those eyes reflected an uncertainty and vulnerability rarely seen in Victoria Preston. Olivia nodded, her expression reserved but not hostile. She had agreed to this meeting only after lengthy discussions with Zoe, weighing the potential benefits and risks of such an encounter. While initially hesitant, she had been struck by the sincerity in Logan's email and his follow-up communications, a young man seemingly determined to chart a different course than his parents. "Zoe felt it was important to respond to your outreach," Olivia explained, her tone professional but not cold. "I respect her judgment in this matter, since she was directly affected by what happened." Zoe, sitting beside her mother and sipping a hot chocolate, studied Logan with the careful assessment of a child who had learned early to read people's intentions. "Your email seemed really honest," she said simply. "Not like you were just trying to fix your family's reputation." Logan flinched slightly at the directness of the observation, but appreciated it nonetheless. "That's not why I reached out," he confirmed. "My parents have their own crisis management team for that. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened and my part in it, or really, my lack of action when I should have done something." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent a lot of time in these past 2 weeks thinking about all the times I've seen my mom do or say things that made me uncomfortable, but I just stayed quiet. The flight wasn't the first time, it was just the first time there were consequences." Olivia's expression softened slightly at the young man's self-awareness. "That's an important recognition. Logan, many adults never reach that level of insight about the behaviors they've normalized." "It shouldn't have taken a viral video for me to speak up," Logan admitted, shame coloring his words. "I've been thinking about why I stayed silent all those times, and honestly, it was just easier. It was comfortable. I didn't have to risk anything." Zoe, who had been quietly observing, suddenly asked, "What happened after with your family?" I mean, the question was direct but not accusatory, reflecting a 12-year-old's natural curiosity about consequences. Logan hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only reasonable approach. "Everything fell apart," he said simply. "Dad lost his job. The company is removing our family name. Their friends have mostly disappeared. They're talking about selling our house because they can't afford it anymore." He shook his head slightly, still processing the dramatic reversal his family had experienced. "But the worst part is that they still don't fully get it. Mom keeps saying things like, 'I'm not a racist. I just have standards,' without seeing the connection. Dad is more focused on the business fallout than on why it happened in the first place." Olivia listened thoughtfully, recognizing the challenging position this teenager was in, caught between loyalty to his family and his emerging moral compass. "And what about you, Logan?" she asked gently. "Where do you see yourself in all this?" It was the question he had been asking himself continuously for 2 weeks, and still didn't have a complete answer for. "I'm trying to figure that out," he admitted. "I know I don't want to be like them, to hold those same assumptions about people, but I'm also recognizing how much of their worldview I've absorbed without even realizing it." He looked directly at Zoe then, his expression earnest. "That's actually why I wanted to meet. Not for forgiveness or to make myself feel better, but because I thought talking to you both might help me see things I'm still missing. If you're willing to have that conversation, I mean," there was a vulnerability in the request that struck both Morgans. Here was a young person at a pivotal moment, genuinely seeking to understand perspectives beyond his privileged upbringing. Zoe looked at her mother, a silent question passing between them. Olivia gave a small nod, leaving the decision to her daughter. "I think we can talk," Zoe said carefully. "But I have questions too." What followed was a remarkable conversation between an unlikely trio: a 12-year-old black girl whose dignity had been publicly assaulted, a 16-year-old white boy from an elite background questioning his family's values for the first time, and a brilliant black CEO who had built her career navigating spaces designed to exclude people like her. Zoe asked direct questions that adults might have danced around. Did your mom teach you to think black people don't belong in nice places? Did you believe her? How does it feel when your family says racist things? Logan answered with an honesty that surprised even himself, acknowledging the subtle and not-so-subtle messages he had received throughout his childhood about who belonged where, which neighborhoods were good, which schools were acceptable, and which families were our kind of people. When I was little, he admitted, I just accepted it all as normal. I didn't know any other way to see the world. It wasn't until I started making friends with kids at school who didn't fit my parents' idea of acceptable that I began to notice the disconnect. Olivia occasionally guided the conversation with thought-provoking questions, but largely allowed the young people to explore their exchange directly, recognizing the unique learning opportunity this represented for both of them. "What happened when you brought friends home who didn't fit your parents' expectations?" she asked at one point. Logan's expression clouded. "I stopped bringing them home. My parents wouldn't be directly rude, but they'd make little comments afterward. Is that boy on scholarship? Or, I'm glad you're being inclusive, but remember who your real friends are." After a while, I kept those friendships separate from my home life. As their drinks cooled and afternoon light slanted through the cafe windows, the conversation evolved from the specific incident to broader questions about privilege, responsibility, and growth. Logan shared his interest in Berkeley's ethics program and his tentative thoughts about pursuing work in corporate responsibility someday. "I used to just assume I'd work at Preston Holdings eventually, without really thinking about it," he explained. "Now that's not an option, which is actually freeing in a way. I can figure out what I actually care about." Zoe nodded, understanding perfectly. "My mom always says that sometimes what seems like a door closing is actually a window opening." "Your mom seems to know a lot," Logan said with a small smile, glancing at Olivia. "Not everything," Olivia replied with surprising humility. "But I've learned that listening to voices we might otherwise ignore often provides the most valuable insights." By the time they prepared to leave, something subtle but significant had shifted. Not friendship, exactly, the circumstances of their meeting were too complex for that, but a connection based on mutual respect and a shared recognition of an important truth that patterns established over generations can be broken by individuals willing to examine them honestly. As they stood to depart, Logan addressed Olivia directly. "Dr. Morgan, I know you didn't have to agree to this meeting. Thank you for giving me the chance to learn from you both." Olivia regarded him thoughtfully. "Change is difficult work, Logan, especially when it means questioning the worldview you've been raised in. But it's necessary work if we want to build a more just world. I respect that you're willing to undertake it." Turning to Zoe, Logan added awkwardly, "I know it's weird, given everything, but would it be okay if we stayed in touch sometimes? Maybe email or something? I feel like I could learn a lot from talking with you." Zoe considered this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "Maybe," she said finally. "I think it depends on what you do with what you're learning. Actions matter more than just talking about things." Her wisdom, simple but profound, struck Logan forcefully. "You're right," Anita agreed. "Completely right." As they parted ways outside the cafe, Logan watched the Morgans walk toward their waiting car, struck by the realization that this brief meeting had taught him more about integrity, dignity, and courage than 16 years in his parents' home. That evening in his hotel room, Logan made two significant decisions that would shape his path forward. First, he emailed his guidance counselor requesting a change to his college application plans, prioritizing schools with strong ethics and social justice programs rather than the business-focused institutions his father had always pushed him toward. Second, he started a private journal documenting his ongoing process of examining his inherited privileges and biases, not for public consumption or social media approval, but as a personal accountability tool for the journey he was undertaking. On the flight back to Chicago the next day, Logan reflected on how dramatically his world had shifted in just 2 weeks. The structures he had once taken for granted, family stability, social position, financial security, clear future path, had all been disrupted. Yet amid this disruption, he was discovering something unexpected, the beginning of an authentic voice and moral compass that was uniquely his own. Not merely an echo of his parents' values, it was uncomfortable, challenging, and occasionally frightening work. But for the first time in his 16 years, it felt genuinely his. Logan's journey was just beginning, and would inevitably include missteps, backsliding, and difficult realizations. The work of unlearning entrenched patterns is never simple or linear, but in taking those first courageous steps toward examining his inherited worldview, he had already begun breaking cycles that had defined his family for generations. 2 weeks after Flight 385, as the Preston family name was being removed from corporate letterhead in buildings across the country, Logan Preston was quietly embarking on his own rebranding, not as a public relations strategy, but as a genuine search for the person he might become when freed from the limitations of who he had been taught to be. The Phoenix Initiative. 1 month after the incident, Olivia Morgan stood before a gathered audience at Phoenix Innovations' San Francisco headquarters. The company's largest conference space had been transformed for the occasion, with a stage adorned with the Phoenix logo, a stylized bird rising from abstract flames that symbolized transformation and renewal. Seated in the front row was Zoe, wearing a purple blazer over a white blouse, her natural hair styled in an elaborate braided crown. Beside her sat members of Phoenix's executive team, representatives from educational and community organizations, and several unexpected guests: Katherine Johnson's granddaughter, Dr. Jasmine Johnson, a physicist at NASA, Dr. Elena Ramirez, an educator specializing in inclusive STEM education, and, most surprisingly, Logan Preston, who had been invited at Zoe's suggestion. Camera crews from major networks and tech publications captured the event as Olivia stepped to the microphone, her presence commanding the room without effort, the natural authority of someone who led by example rather than intimidation. "Thank you all for joining us today," she began, her voice clear and resolute. "1 month ago, my daughter Zoe and I experienced something that has happened to many families of color in spaces where others don't expect to see them. What made our experience unusual wasn't that it occurred, but that it was captured on video and witnessed by millions." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. When moments like these go viral, there's often a predictable cycle: outrage, discussion, and then, too frequently, a return to business as usual without substantive change. Today, we're here to break that cycle. With that introduction, Olivia officially launched the Phoenix Initiative, a comprehensive $50 million program designed to support young people from underrepresented communities in pursuing careers in STEM fields. The Phoenix Initiative isn't about one incident or one family's experience, Olivia explained. It's about transforming a painful moment into lasting, systemic change that opens doors for thousands of young people who have been made to feel they don't belong in spaces of innovation and leadership. The initiative comprised several interlocking programs. The Visible Figures Scholarship Fund would provide full financial support for 100 students annually to pursue degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, with a focus on young women of color. The Belonging in STEM Mentorship Program would pair industry professionals with middle and high school students, creating pathways and support networks for those traditionally excluded from tech careers. The Innovation Access Grants would fund technology resources and curriculum development for schools in underserved communities, ensuring that talent could be nurtured regardless of zip code or school district wealth. The Inclusive Leadership Institute would work with companies across the tech sector to develop cultures that genuinely valued diverse perspectives and experiences. As Olivia outlined each component, digital screens behind her displayed the faces of young people already selected for the pilot programs, their diverse backgrounds and brilliant potential visible in their expressions. "This initiative isn't charity," Olivia emphasized, her voice taking on additional passion. "It's an investment in talent that has too often been overlooked, discouraged, or actively excluded. It's an acknowledgement that innovation thrives when we remove artificial barriers to participation, And it's a commitment to building a tech ecosystem that reflects and serves all communities, not just a privileged few. She then invited Zoe to join her on stage, a moment that visibly moved many in the audience. Recognizing the young girl who had maintained such remarkable composure when wine was poured on her simply for existing in a space someone felt she didn't belong in. Zoe approached the microphone with poise beyond her 12 years, adjusted it slightly to her height, and addressed the audience with clear, confident words. When my book was ruined on that flight, I was really upset because it was signed by Katherine Johnson, one of my heroes. She was a mathematician who calculated flight paths for NASA astronauts when computers weren't reliable enough. But people didn't think she belonged in those rooms either. Zoe paused, her gaze momentarily finding Logan in the audience before continuing. My mom always taught me that our dignity isn't determined by other people's opinions of us. But I've been thinking that maybe dignity isn't enough. Maybe we also need opportunity. That's what this initiative is about, making sure other kids like me get chances to pursue their dreams in science and technology, even when some people think they don't belong. The simplicity and wisdom of her statement resonated throughout the room, drawing spontaneous applause. Dr. Jasmine Johnson discreetly wiped away a tear, moved by the connection between her grandmother's legacy and this young girl's experience. When Olivia returned to the microphone, she unveiled the final component of the initiative, a special exhibition that would travel to science museums across the country, featuring the wine-stained copy of Hidden Figures alongside interactive displays highlighting the contributions of underrepresented innovators throughout history. This book, Damaged in a Moment of Prejudice, will now serve as a powerful educational tool, Olivia explained. It will remind us that attempts to exclude people from spaces of innovation ultimately fail when we respond not with anger or retaliation, but with renewed commitment to opening doors wider. The launch event continued with panel discussions featuring education experts, tech industry leaders, and young STEM innovators from diverse backgrounds. Throughout, there was a careful balance, acknowledging the incident that had catalyzed the initiative without allowing it to overshadow the forward-looking mission. After the formal presentations concluded and the networking reception began, Olivia noticed Logan Preston standing somewhat awkwardly at the periphery of the crowd. She approached him with genuine curiosity about his presence. "Logan, I'm glad you could join us today," she said. "What did you think of the initiative?" He met her gaze with a directness that reflected his ongoing journey toward authenticity. "It's incredible, Dr. Morgan, especially how you've turned something so negative into something that will help thousands of kids." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking a lot about what Zoe said to me a couple weeks ago, that actions matter more than just talking about things. I was wondering if there might be some way I could contribute to the initiative, not with my name or anything like that, but maybe with time or work. I want to be part of solutions, not just feel bad about problems." Olivia considered his request thoughtfully. "I appreciate that. Logan, meaningful change does require action, not just awareness. Let me connect you with our volunteer coordinator for the Chicago pilot program. Starting with listening and learning would be appropriate before moving into more active roles." Logan nodded, understanding both the opportunity and its limitations. "That's fair. I have a lot to learn first." As the reception continued around them, Olivia observed the young man with a mixture of professional assessment and maternal insight. His journey represented something significant, the potential for genuine transformation when privilege is confronted with its consequences and responds with humility rather than defensiveness. By the evening's end, the Phoenix Initiative had generated substantial media coverage, industry commitments, and matching donations that expanded its initial scope. What had begun as a corporate response to a painful incident had evolved into a movement with potential for lasting systemic impact. Back in their hotel suite that night, as Zoe prepared for bed, Olivia reflected on the month's journey, from the shock and hurt of the wine incident to the launch of an initiative that would create opportunities for thousands of young people. "Mom," Zoe called from the bathroom where she was brushing her teeth, "do you think Logan is really changing, or just feeling guilty?" The question reflected her daughter's perceptive nature, always looking beyond surface appearances to underlying motivations. "I think genuine change is possible but never guaranteed," Olivia replied carefully. "It requires constant self-examination and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Logan seems to be doing that work, but only time will tell if it's sustained. Zoe emerged, considering this answer. I hope he does change, not for him, but because it would mean people really can grow beyond what they're taught. In that simple observation, Olivia heard the wisdom that continually amazed her about her daughter, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to broader principles and possibilities. 1 month after Flight 385, the story had evolved from a viral moment of cruelty to a structured initiative for systemic change. The wine stains on Zoe's blouse had washed away, but their impact continued rippling outward, transforming not just the lives of those directly involved, but potentially thousands more who would benefit from new pathways into fields where they had previously been made to feel they didn't belong. The Phoenix Initiative, like its namesake, had emerged from painful circumstances to create something new and powerful, a testament to the principle that how we respond to harm ultimately matters more than the harm itself. Victoria's redemption arc 3 months after the incident on Flight 385. Victoria Preston stood in the children's section of the Jackson Heights Community Center, a world away from the exclusive spaces she had once considered her natural habitat. The center, located in one of Chicago's most diverse neighborhoods, served families from a wide range of cultural, linguistic, and economic backgrounds, precisely the kind of place Victoria would have previously avoided or viewed through the lens of charity rather than community. Today, she wore no designer labels. Her pearl necklace and diamond earrings remained in their velvet-lined boxes at home. Instead, she was dressed in practical slacks and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, her face bearing only minimal makeup. The transformation in her appearance reflected a deeper process unfolding within, halting, imperfect, but genuine. "Ms. Victoria, can you help me with this word?" asked 8-year-old Gabriela Martinez, pointing to a challenging term in the book they were reading together. Victoria leaned closer, focusing on the child rather than the scattered background thoughts that still occasionally surfaced, unwelcome reminders of her former self wondering what her country club friends would think if they could see her now, sitting cross-legged on a worn carpet beside a child whose parents had emigrated from El Salvador. "Sound it out with me," Victoria suggested, using the techniques she had learned in the literacy volunteer training program. "Let's break it into parts." Together, they worked through the word, Gabriela's face lighting up with accomplishment when she finally pronounced it correctly. "I did it." "You certainly did," Victoria affirmed, the genuine warmth in her voice surprising even herself. 3 months ago, such an interaction would have been unimaginable, not just because Victoria wouldn't have been in this community center, but because she wouldn't have seen this child as fully human, worthy of her undivided attention and respect. Across the room, Lucia Hernandez, the center's director, observed the interaction with measured approval. When Victoria had first appeared at the center 6 weeks ago, presenting the recommendation letter from her therapist and asking about volunteer opportunities, Lucia had been deeply skeptical. She had recognized Victoria immediately from the viral videos and news coverage, and her initial instinct had been to reject the application outright. "With respect, Mrs. Preston," Lucia had said during that first meeting, "our center serves many families of color. Given the incident that's now public knowledge, I have concerns about whether this is an appropriate placement for you." Victoria had flinched at the directness, but hadn't attempted to defend herself or minimize what had happened. "I understand your concerns," she had replied, her voice quieter than the confident tones she had once used to command rooms. "I'm not here to rehabilitate my image or check a community service box. I'm here because I need to unlearn patterns I've carried my entire life, and that requires putting myself in spaces where I'm not the center or the authority." The humility in that response, so different from the entitlement Victoria had once embodied, had intrigued Lucia enough to offer a probationary volunteer position. With clear conditions, Victoria would work under constant supervision, receive ongoing feedback, and be immediately removed if any concerning behavior emerged. 6 weeks later, Lucia had been surprised by Victoria's consistent commitment and willingness to receive feedback, even when it was uncomfortable. Today, watching her work patiently with Gabriela, Lucia could see tangible evidence of the change process Victoria was undertaking, not a complete transformation, but a genuine beginning. As the afternoon writing session concluded, Victoria helped the children return books to shelves and clean up craft supplies, tasks she had once considered beneath her dignity but now approached with straightforward practicality. When the last child had been picked up by parents or guardians, she approached Lucia with a question that had been forming throughout the afternoon. Miss Hernandez, I noticed that many of the children are struggling with the same vocabulary gaps. I was wondering if it might be helpful to develop some targeted exercises focused on those specific challenges. Lucia considered both the suggestion and its delivery, offered as a tentative idea rather than an executive directive, acknowledging the children's needs rather than positioning Victoria as their savior. That could be valuable, Lucia agreed. If you'd like to draft something, I can review it and provide feedback before we implement it. Victoria nodded, accepting both the opportunity and its limitations. Thank you. I'll work on it this evening. As Victoria gathered her belongings to leave, Lucia made a decision. Mrs. Preston, Victoria, if you have time, I'd like to speak with you briefly in my office. Once seated in Lucia's modest office, surrounded by children's artwork and community awards, Victoria felt a familiar tension, the uncertainty of navigating a space where she held no automatic authority or deference. You've been here 6 weeks now, Lucia began, her tone professional but not unkind. I want to provide some feedback on what I've observed. Victoria nodded, bracing herself. Despite the intensive therapy she'd been undergoing, direct feedback remained challenging for someone who had spent decades being insulated from consequences by wealth and privilege. When you first came here, Lucia continued, I was skeptical about your motivations and capacity for change. I've been watching carefully, and while I still have some reservations, I can see genuine effort and improvement. She paused, organizing her thoughts. Your interactions with the children have become more natural and respectful. You've stopped using that particular tone when speaking with our immigrant families, and you've been consistently receptive to guidance, even when it clearly makes you uncomfortable. Victoria absorbed this assessment, finding unexpected emotion rising in response to this simple professional acknowledgement of her efforts. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm trying to do the work, not just talk about it. I can see that, Lucia affirmed, which is why I want to offer you the opportunity to increase your involvement here. We have a literacy program specifically for adults working toward their GED or improving their English for employment opportunities. Given your educational background, you could be a valuable tutor if you're interested. The offer represented a significant shift, from closely supervised work with children to more independent responsibility with adults, a vote of confidence in Victoria's continuing growth. I'd be honored, Victoria replied, the genuine gratitude in her voice reflecting how dramatically her perspective had changed. 3 months ago, she would have considered such work beneath her. Now she recognized it as a privilege she hadn't earned, but was being granted as an opportunity to contribute meaningfully. As Victoria left the community center and walked to her car, no longer the luxury SUV, but a modest sedan that reflected the Preston family's dramatically altered financial circumstances, she reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. The initial aftermath of the Flight 385 incident had been devastating in ways she couldn't have imagined. Beyond Richard's job loss and the financial implications, beyond the social ostracism and public condemnation, the most profound consequence had been the shattering of Victoria's self-image. For the first time in her adult life, she had been forced to see herself through others' eyes, not the carefully curated persona she had constructed, but the reality of who she had become, someone who would pour wine on a child because of the color of her skin. The realization had initially broken her in ways therapy termed identity crisis, a complete collapse of self-concept that left her alternating between desperate denial and overwhelming shame. There had been dark days when she barely left her bedroom, when the thought of facing a world that now saw her true nature seemed impossible. Dr. Ramirez had been instrumental in guiding her through this painful process, helping her understand that true growth required fully acknowledging the harm she had caused before any redemption could begin. The goal isn't to escape consequences or rebuild your reputation, Dr. Ramirez had explained. The goal is to become a person who would never again cause the kind of harm you inflicted on that flight. That perspective, focusing on genuine transformation rather than image rehabilitation, had slowly shifted Victoria's approach to her situation. Instead of seeking ways to minimize or justify her actions, she had begun the difficult work of examining the beliefs and assumptions that had shaped her behavior. The process was ongoing and often painful, Victoria still caught herself making judgments based on deeply ingrained biases. She still occasionally resented the loss of her former position and privileges. She still struggled with the fundamental reorientation required to see people, unlike herself, as fully human rather than supporting characters in her life story. But something was genuinely changing, in small increments rather than dramatic revelations. The satisfaction she felt helping Gabriella master a difficult word was real. The self-reflection triggered by Lucia's feedback was authentic. The gratitude for being offered increased responsibility at the community center was genuine. As Victoria drove home to the smaller house in a less prestigious neighborhood that the family had moved to after selling their mansion, she considered what to tell Richard about Lucia's offer. Their marriage had been strained by the crisis, with Richard alternating between blaming Victoria for the family's downfall and recognizing his own complicity in the worldview they had shared. They were both in therapy now, individually and as a couple, working to determine whether their relationship could evolve beyond the foundations of social position and financial success that had previously defined it. The process was uncertain, the outcome unclear, but for perhaps the first time in their marriage, they were engaging with each other as flawed, struggling human beings rather than as complementary social assets. Logan remained the most distant family member. His relationship with his parents fundamentally altered by the incident and its aftermath. He had returned to in-person classes but spent increased time with friends whose parents had previously been considered not quite the right sort by Victoria. His college applications now focused on schools with strong ethics and social justice programs, a direction neither parent would have approved before, but now lacked the moral authority to challenge. The family dynamics were evolving in ways none of them could have predicted 3 months earlier, painful but potentially healthier. If they continued the difficult work of honest self-examination and growth. As Victoria parked in front of their new home, modest by their former standards but still comfortable by any objective measure, she felt the complex mixture of emotions that now characterized her daily life: grief for the person she had been, shame for the harm she had caused, uncertainty about who she was becoming, and occasionally, briefly, a quiet hope that meaningful change was possible, even for someone who had spent decades moving through the world with such profound blindness to her own privilege and its cost to others. 3 months after Flight 385, Victoria Preston's redemption arc was just beginning, not a dramatic narrative of transformation and forgiveness, but a quieter, more authentic process of gradual awakening to the humanity of others and the possibility of becoming someone different than who she had always been. The wine had been poured in an instant, but the path toward genuine atonement would require years of consistent, humble effort, a journey Victoria was only beginning to understand but had, at least, finally started to walk. Resolution and future impact. 1 year after the incident on Flight 385, the ripple effects continued to transform lives, organizations, and conversations about dignity, privilege, and accountability in American society. At Phoenix Innovation's headquarters in San Francisco, Olivia Morgan stood before a wall displaying photographs of the first cohort of Visible Figures Scholarship recipients, 50 brilliant young people from underrepresented communities now pursuing degrees in STEM fields at top universities across the country. Beside her stood Zoe, now 13 and noticeably taller, her natural confidence continuing to develop alongside her academic interests. "I still can't believe how much has grown from that awful moment," Zoe reflected, studying the faces of students whose educational journeys were being supported by the initiative born from her experience. "All these people getting opportunities because someone poured wine on my book," Olivia smiled, placing an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "That's how transformation works, sweetheart. Sometimes our hardest moments become catalysts for our most important work." The Phoenix Initiative had expanded beyond its initial scope, growing from a $50 million commitment to a $120 million program as additional companies joined the effort. Over 200 tech firms had now adopted the initiative's inclusive recruitment and retention frameworks. 12,000 students had participated in STEM enrichment programs funded by the initiative, and the traveling exhibition featuring Zoe's wine-stained book had been viewed by over 300,000 people across 15 cities. The business impact had been equally significant. After walking away from the Preston Holdings acquisition, Phoenix had partnered with Takahashi Precision, a Japanese manufacturing firm whose values aligned more closely with their own. The collaboration had proven more successful than analysts predicted, with Phoenix's new diagnostic hardware now in use at 78% of major medical centers nationwide, reducing misdiagnosis rates and saving countless lives. Phoenix Innovation stock had risen 43% over the year, reflecting both strong fundamentals and the market's positive response to values-based leadership. Zoe Morgan had been named CEO of the Year by 3 major business publications, with particular emphasis on how her handling of the Flight 385 incident demonstrated the concrete business value of ethical decision-making and organizational integrity. For the Preston family, the year had brought continued challenges and gradual evolution. Preston Holdings had ultimately been acquired at a fraction of its former valuation, the family name removed from all corporate branding. Richard Preston had struggled to find new executive opportunities, eventually accepting a teaching position at a business school where he now, somewhat ironically, lectured on corporate ethics and the consequences of culturally insular leadership. Victoria's redemption journey had continued with gradual but meaningful progress. After 6 months of volunteer work at the Jackson Heights Community Center, she had been offered a part-time position coordinating their adult literacy program. The role paid a fraction of what she had once spent on a single charity gala ticket, but provided something her previous life had never offered: the satisfaction of contributing directly to others' growth and seeing the concrete impact of her work. Her relationship with Lucia Hernandez had evolved from wary professional supervision to cautious mutual respect, as Victoria consistently demonstrated willingness to learn from her mistakes, receive feedback without defensiveness, and prioritize the needs of the community members she served. "You're not the same person who walked through that door a year ago," Lucia had observed during Victoria's performance review. "The changes are substantial and appear genuine, but this work is never finished. It's a lifelong commitment to continued growth and awareness." Victoria had nodded, understanding both the acknowledgement and its limitations. "I know," she had replied. "I'm still catching myself making assumptions or judgments I was raised with. The difference is that now I recognize them and can choose differently." That capacity for honest self-reflection, so absent in the woman who had poured wine on a child for existing in what she considered an exclusive space, represented perhaps the most significant transformation in Victoria's ongoing journey. Logan Preston, now 17 and preparing for his final year of high school, had continued charting his own course distinct from his family's former values. His cautious communication with Zoe Morgan had evolved into a genuine friendship conducted primarily through email and occasional video calls, with both young people finding value in their unlikely connection. Through Zoe's influence, Logan had become involved with the Phoenix Initiative's Youth Leadership Council, helping design mentorship programs that connected privileged students with peers from underrepresented backgrounds in collaborative STEM projects. His work had been featured in several educational publications, with careful attention to centering the experiences of the students served rather than positioning himself as a savior figure. Logan had recently been accepted early to Berkeley's Ethics and Social Justice program, a direction that would have been unimaginable in the family's previous life, but now represented a source of quiet pride for parents gradually recognizing the wisdom in their son's chosen path. The broader societal impact of the Flight 385 incident continued evolving in complex and sometimes surprising ways. Harvard Business School now included the Morgan-Preston case as required reading in their ethics curriculum, analyzing how personal conduct, corporate values, and financial outcomes intersect in the digital age. The case study was being taught at 47 universities worldwide, ensuring that future business leaders would understand the material consequences of ethical failures. Major airlines had implemented enhanced bias response protocols, with flight attendant training now including specific modules on recognizing and addressing discriminatory behavior among passengers. The industry had seen a 62% decrease in reported bias incidents over the year, suggesting that clearer consequences and proactive intervention were creating measurable improvements in passenger experiences. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had sparked ongoing conversations about belonging, dignity, and accountability in elite spaces. Panel discussions, documentary segments, and educational programs continued exploring the persistent reality of who is assumed to belong in first-class cabins, executive boardrooms, exclusive schools, and prestigious neighborhoods, and the profound costs of these assumptions to both individuals and society. On the anniversary of the incident, Olivia and Zoe Morgan participated in a special event at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where the wine-stained copy of Hidden Figures had found a permanent home. Displayed in a section about ongoing struggles for dignity and recognition, the book had become a powerful teaching tool, a tangible reminder that the same prejudices Katherine Johnson had faced in NASA facilities decades earlier continued manifesting in different forms today. During the panel discussion following the exhibition opening, a moderator asked Olivia what message she hoped visitors would take from seeing the damaged book. "I hope they understand that dignity isn't just an abstract concept. It's a daily lived experience that can be affirmed or assaulted in moments that might seem minor to bystanders, but have profound impact on those experiencing them," Olivia replied. "And I hope they recognize that how we respond to these moments, whether as targets, perpetrators, or witnesses, shapes not just individual lives but our collective future." When the moderator turned to Zoe with a similar question, her response reflected the wisdom beyond her years that continued to impress all who encountered her. "I want people to see that books can get damaged, but stories continue," she said simply. The wine stained the pages, but it didn't stop Katherine Johnson's story from inspiring people, and it didn't stop my story from becoming something that helps other kids like me know they belong wherever their talents take them. As the audience applauded the young girl's insight, Olivia felt a profound gratitude for her daughter's resilience and perspective. The incident on Flight 385 had been painful and unnecessary, but Zoe had transformed it from a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for growth that extended far beyond their personal experience. 1 year later, the message was clear: wine stains eventually fade, but the impact of how we treat one another and how we respond when treated cruelly can reverberate for generations. What had begun as one woman's attempt to enforce arbitrary boundaries of belonging had instead sparked a movement that was systematically dismantling those very boundaries, creating spaces where dignity was recognized as the birthright of every human being rather than a privilege to be granted or withheld based on appearance, background, or circumstance. The resolution wasn't about perfect justice or complete transformation. It was about the ongoing, imperfect human work of creating a world where fewer children would experience what Zoe Morgan had endured on that flight, and where those who did would find, as she had, that such moments could become catalysts for change rather than merely wounds to be endured. The wine-stained copy of Hidden Figures, now preserved under climate-controlled glass at the Smithsonian, had become more than just an artifact of a viral moment. 5 years after Flight 385, it served as a powerful educational tool, prompting discussions about belonging, dignity, and the evolving nature of prejudice in American society. Museum docents reported that the exhibit consistently generated the longest visitor engagement times, with people of all backgrounds pausing to reflect on what the damaged book represented. "What's remarkable about this artifact," explained Dr. Marcus Wilson, now chief curator of digital culture at the museum, "is how it connects past and present forms of exclusion. The book tells the story of Black women mathematicians who were essential to NASA's success, yet relegated to segregated facilities. The wine stains represent how similar patterns of who belongs in certain spaces continue today. Though in evolved forms, its history made tangible and immediate. The business world had incorporated lessons from the Morgan-Preston case into fundamental practices and policies. Harvard Business School professor Janelle Washington had developed the case study that was now taught at over 200 universities globally. What made this incident so instructive wasn't just the ethical dimensions, Dr. Barn Washington explained during a recent faculty symposium. It was the concrete demonstration that values-based leadership directly impacts financial outcomes. We've moved beyond the false dichotomy of ethics versus profits to a more sophisticated understanding of how they interrelate. Indeed, the financial aftermath had been instructive. Phoenix Innovations had not only survived walking away from the Preston acquisition, but thrived, growing to a $38 billion valuation with groundbreaking AI diagnostic systems, now standard in healthcare facilities worldwide. The company's governance structure, which explicitly balanced stakeholder interests rather than focusing solely on shareholder value, had become a model studied and increasingly emulated across industries. The Morgan effect, as business journals termed it, described the measurable shift in corporate governance that prioritized ethical leadership and inclusive practices, not as optional PR initiatives, but as core business values with measurable financial impact. 62. Fortune 500 companies had adopted bias response protocols named after Olivia, implementing training specifically designed to help employees intervene when witnessing discrimination rather than remaining silent bystanders. Preston Holdings had undergone a complete transformation after being acquired by a private equity firm, rebranded as Meridian Manufacturing. The company had rebuilt itself with an entirely new leadership team and corporate culture, eventually stabilizing as a mid-sized player in a changing industry. The Preston name had faded from business prominence, becoming instead a case study in how quickly accumulated privilege can collapse when exposed to genuine accountability. For the individuals involved, the incident had shaped life trajectories in profound and sometimes surprising ways. Olivia Morgan remained CEO of Phoenix Innovations, though she had restructured her role to allow more time for the educational foundation that had grown from the initial Phoenix initiative. Under her leadership, the Visible Figures program had supported over 5,000 students from underrepresented backgrounds in pursuing STEM education and careers. Many of these students were now emerging as leaders in their fields, creating a powerful multiplier effect as they mentored others and shaped more inclusive institutional cultures. In a recent interview with Harvard Business Review, Olivia reflected on how the Flight 385 incident had influenced her leadership philosophy. That moment crystallized something I had always believed but perhaps hadn't fully articulated. That true leadership isn't about exercising power over others, but about maintaining your principles even when doing so carries costs. Walking away from that acquisition was financially expensive in the short term, but the clarity it provided about who we are as a company has been invaluable. Zoe Morgan, now 18 and preparing to begin her undergraduate studies at MIT, had emerged as a powerful voice in her own right. Her TEDx talk, The Dignity Algorithm, exploring how small moments of inclusion or exclusion shape individual and collective futures, had been viewed over 3 million times. As she prepared to study astrophysics, inspired by the women of Hidden Figures, whose stories had so captivated her as a child, Zoe carried forward the lessons of that flight in her own distinctive voice. What I remember most clearly about that day, she shared during her college admission interview, wasn't the wine or the humiliation. It was watching my mother respond with such clarity and dignity. She showed me that how we handle our worst moments ultimately matters more than the moments themselves. Victoria Preston's redemption journey had continued with gradual, genuine progress. After several years of part-time work at the Jackson Heights Community Center, she had completed a master's degree in education and now served as the center's full-time literacy program director. Her work had expanded to include developing culturally responsive curriculum for adult learners navigating educational systems that often failed to recognize their existing knowledge and capabilities. In a recent panel discussion about privilege and accountability, Victoria spoke with hard-earned humility about her ongoing evolution. I won't pretend there was one dramatic moment of transformation. It's been a daily process of catching myself, questioning assumptions I was raised with, and choosing differently. The work is never finished, and that's as it should be. Growth isn't a destination, but a continuous journey. Richard Preston had found unexpected purpose in his academic role, where he now taught an ethics course specifically examining how corporate cultures enable or constrain individual moral choices. His personal experience, transformed into an educational case study, provided powerful lessons for business students about the interconnection between leadership failures, organizational culture, and ethical blindness. I spent decades viewing business success narrowly through financial metrics. Richard acknowledged in a recent faculty publication, "What I failed to understand was how corporate culture shapes not just organizational outcomes, but individual character. The company I led reflected and reinforced values that ultimately proved destructive to others, to the organization itself, and to my own moral compass." Logan Preston, now a graduate student in Berkeley's Ethics and Social Justice program, had maintained his connection with Zoe Morgan, their unlikely friendship evolving into a productive collaboration on several initiatives bridging privileged and marginalized communities. His undergraduate thesis, Inheriting Blindness, Examining Unearned Privilege Through Critical Self-Reflection, had won university honors and been adapted into a curriculum now used in several high schools. In a recent interview with an educational journal, Logan reflected on his journey since Flight 385. I often think about how differently that situation could have unfolded if my mother had simply recognized Olivia and Zoe's humanity from the beginning. The irony is that in trying to enforce artificial boundaries of belonging, she ultimately lost her own place in the world she valued. But from that loss came the possibility of building something more authentic and meaningful. Beyond the individual stories, the incident had catalyzed broader systemic changes. Airlines had implemented comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff, with clear protocols for addressing discriminatory behavior. Educational institutions had incorporated the case study into discussions of belonging, dignity, and civil discourse. Corporate boards increasingly recognized the material risks of leadership cultures that enabled or ignored biased behavior. The legacy of Flight 385 extended beyond policies and programs to fundamental questions about American identity and belonging. Who is automatically assumed to be in place in first-class cabins, executive boardrooms, or elite universities? Who must continuously justify their presence? How do these patterns of presumed belonging or exclusion shape individual lives and collective possibilities? The Weinstein book preserved at the Smithsonian offered no simple answers to these questions. Instead, it invited visitors to examine their own assumptions about who belongs where and to consider how they might respond as targets, perpetrators, or witnesses when these assumptions manifest in daily interactions. 5 years after that fateful flight, the legacy continued unfolding in countless individual choices, institutional practices, and cultural conversations. The incident had demonstrated, in painfully clear terms, how prejudice persists even in supposedly enlightened spaces. But it had also revealed the transformative power of responding to such moments with dignity rather than retribution, with principle rather than performance, with a commitment to creating change rather than merely exposing harm. As Olivia Morgan often noted when asked about the incident that had unexpectedly defined a chapter of her life, the most powerful response to being treated as if you don't belong isn't fighting for acceptance in spaces designed to exclude you. It's recognizing your inherent dignity, regardless of others' perceptions, and then using whatever influence you have to create spaces where everyone's humanity is recognized and valued. That ongoing work, in boardrooms and classrooms, in public spaces and private conversations, represented the true legacy of Flight 385, not just a viral moment of caught-on-camera cruelty, but the countless acts of reflection, recognition, and recreation sparked by that moment, rippling outward in ways that continued transforming individual lives and collective possibilities. Weinsteins had faded, but the lessons remained. YouTube call to action. As we reach the end of this journey together, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to witness this powerful story of dignity, consequences, and transformation. What began as a moment of cruelty at 35,000 feet evolved into something far more profound, a catalyst for change that continues reshaping lives, organizations, and conversations about who belongs in spaces of privilege and power. This story resonates because, in some way, we've all experienced or witnessed moments where belonging is questioned, where dignity is challenged, where the simple right to exist in certain spaces is somehow deemed debatable. Whether you've been in Zoe's position, feeling the sting of exclusion, or recognized yourself in Logan's journey of questioning inherited blindness, or even seen aspects of Victoria's transformation in your own growth, these experiences connect us in our shared humanity. I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments below. Have you witnessed similar moments of exclusion? Have you been part of transformations, personal or institutional, sparked by difficult reckonings? Your story matters, and in sharing it, you contribute to the ongoing conversation about creating more just and inclusive spaces for all. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Black and Bruised Stories. Each week, we bring you narratives that go beyond viral moments to explore the complex realities of dignity, justice, and transformation in American life. Ring that notification bell to join our community dedicated to stories that matter. Remember, our worth isn't determined by other people's opinions of us, but by how we choose to respond when tested. Sometimes the most powerful reply to exclusion isn't fighting for acceptance in spaces designed to keep us out. It's recognizing our inherent dignity and creating new spaces where everyone's humanity is valued. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember that change happens one interaction, one reflection, one decision at a time. And in that ongoing work, we all have a part to play.